Okay, I'm starting this recording. Okay, so this recording is an attempt to make a condensed run-through of the sort of the Kegan stages and my model of psychology, which is essentially the four sides of the mind, which is very much parallel with the MBTI type four sides of the mind. That's a very good starting point to explain my system, and that is essentially because MBTI is a pretty good approximate, and I can use a lot of MBTI jargon and terminology and kind of get away with it pretty easily. The only thing that I disagree with in MBTI is the actual structure of the cognitive functions. In my system, there are 17 cognitive functions. In MBTI, there are only 8. And then there are very particular set patterns within MBTI structures of type, in which basically, if you know the position of two cognitive functions, you can know exactly the MBTI type that you are referencing. And there are 16 MBTI types. In my system, there are 17 metatypes, and you only need to know one cognitive function in one position to know which type that you're talking about in terms of metatype. Then my system also has something that's pretty much like Enneagram. Like in typology circles, usually people will somewhat know their MBTI type, or they will try to know what their MBTI type is, which is problematic because it's an approximate system and some people have a lot of trouble trying to find a pigeonhole, essentially. And because the system, I think, is fundamentally flawed and approximate, some people really don't have a stable pigeonhole. I mean, I would just say that there are 17 metatypes in my system and there are only 16 MBTI types, so there's a fundamental mismatch there. So even, in terms of the number, there is going to be some kind of conflation somewhere between what a type is. And then the thing that really confuses this is that in my system, I have something that is like Enneagram. I call it metagram, and metagram is a kind of circuitry which kind of puts cross wires into the metatype, but it also does a whole lot of other things as well. And I've I don't know if I will be able to kind of give a condensed summary of how metagram and metatype sort of interrelate with one another, because it is confusing. It is like fundamentally a bit of a muddle between the two, because it's something like metagram fits inside of metatype, and then it kind of jumbles up metatype, and in some sense this is all to do with the trouble of Keegan stage 3. Okay, so rather let me just get into start talking about the model, and then the things, issues like that I might be able to get into. I will give my general the point of this recording is actually for me to recapitulate a condensed version of self-actualization, which is basically the description of Keegan stage 5. So basically the point of this recording is to, at the end of it, have a nice go-to recording that essentially lays out all the groundwork of what I would even call sort of in the inspiration that I took to work out how to get from Keegan stage 4 to Keegan stage 5, which is much more complicated than I think people think it is. It's much more involved than people think it is, and it also is much more easier to see how it functions from the perspective of the four sides of the mind. Okay, so there is no... Okay, well, yeah, so there are fundamentally four sides of the mind, and those four sides of the mind go in the ontological order that I'm about to describe them. The first side of the mind is the superego. The second side of the mind is the subconscious. The third is the unconscious, and the fourth is the ego. And that's all there is. They're just those four sides of the mind. Keegan stage 5, when it's properly attained, because I do think that a lot of people that think they have reached Keegan stage 5 are actually in a kind of Keegan stage 4, and then they are tending to their other sides of the mind downwards from their Kegan stage 4, but to actually be in Kegan stage 5, you need to reach up from Kegan stage 4 into the stage 1. You need to fix your superego, because everyone's superego is fundamentally unfinished, because essentially the beginning of the false ego complex is that you have a floating parent function in your superego. And I use the archetype of the false prophet in the Christian scripture, specifically in Revelations, in the dream of St. John at Patmos. That the description of the false prophet is exactly, I think, that floating parent function. The reason why it's a floating parent function is because the superego has no structure behind it. It doesn't have a dominant function behind it, and that's its key problem, is that it doesn't have a dominant function, so it just has a floating parent function that can just do whatever it wants to the subconscious, because it can just change its backstory. It has, and so this is what makes it a false prophet, is that it has no real anchor, it has no real character, so it can just keep on making pretty promises all day, every day. And it's more complicated than that, because I'm going to have to get into also other structures of why the MBTI doesn't fall short. So each side of the mind does not have 4 functions, it actually has 6 functions. But it's more complicated than that. So each side of the mind has 6. But there's also a mismatch in that 2 of those 6, the last 2 of those 6, are shared by the next side of the mind. So there's an overlap between each side of the mind. And where the overlap occurs would be in MBTI language, the inferior function, and the preceding function, which I call the sin. So I mean, so I can talk about each of these 6 component parts in MBTI, and I can talk about them in sort of my own language in my system. So let me just do it in my own language first, and then I'll give the MBTI language. So generically speaking, each side of the mind has space for a slot, and they go in this order. They go death, lust, vanity, enticed lust, trial, sin. So those are the 6 component parts. Now sometimes I also call in scripture they're used slightly different words, but I kind of those are pretty good terms. But essentially, when James is talking about when you are drawn away by the lust, to be drawn away by the lust is vanity, and then you are enticed by the lust, and then there's a trial, and then once you have conceived of the lust, then there is sin, because once you have conceived of the lust, then you've missed the mark. So the sin is essentially. So let me talk about the MBTI language first. So in some sense, the death and the sin don't really have a stable description within MBTI, except that the death of one side of the mind is the lust of the preceding side of the mind, and the trial of one side of the mind is the the trial is the inferior function in MBTI, so that has a correlation. But but essentially, usually the death and the sin, these are things that clearly they half break the MBTI mold, because as I said, the sin of one side of the mind is the lust of another side of the mind when it gets repurposed and a new side of the mind forms, which is in some sense, it forms within the context of the parent function of the last side of the mind. What gives the new side of the mind its new sort of entity status is the parent function of the last side of the mind that is so dissatisfied with its own inferior function and its own sin that it wants to kind of jettison those 2 things, and it does so by creating a new entity, which is the new side of the mind. And then what is essentially receiving those 2 floating children that are being is given up for adoption is the dominant function in the next side of the mind. So the dominant function is receiving what the parent function of the last side of the mind is jettisoning. Okay, and then so the other thing to talk about here is So the inferior function of one side of the mind becomes the death of another side of the mind, and the sin of one side of the mind becomes the lust of the next side of the mind. And the lust is also the child function. That's right. Let me go through that. So in MBTI language, you have a death, you have a child function, you have a dominant function or a hero function. There's those jargon in MBTI mean the same thing. You have a parent function, which is the enticed lust, and you have a trial, which is the inferior function. So the actual ordering in MBTI in terms of the structure of the cognitive functions. And by the way, when I say proceeding, and I'm, because essentially in my model, all the cognitive functions, of which there are 17 cognitive functions, they all have a fixed order. They exist in a pyramid structure, essentially. And that pyramid, when you go over the top, you end up at the bottom again. So it leads into itself. It's like a fractal in that sense. And so, because my cognitive function, because my deep theory of mind is based on essentially a metaphysics of cognitive functions, and that is stable, I only need to know what one cognitive function is in your metatype, and I know what your metatype is. Whereas in MBTI, you have to know two cognitive functions to work out on a piece of paper. Or in some sense, you need to know the right two, because if you know someone's dominant function, you will already know by correspondence, you will know their nemesis function. But you need to know sort of two slots in the same side of the mind to work out what MBTI type they are. Actually, you can't even parameterize it like that. That's not enough, because if you know, for example, the dominant and the if you know the dominant and the inferior, that's not enough. So you kind of have to know two adjacent slots or a corresponding. Never mind, this is a technical thing, but basically, it's necessary to. It's not necessarily sufficient, but it is certainly necessary that you need to know two cognitive functions in MBTI. You need to know, let's say, the right kind of two functions before you can work out what the type is. Because you might have the second slot might be redundant relative to the first slot, because it's so dependent on the rules of constructing an MBTI type. And those rules are basically wrong. They are pretty good approximates, but they are basically, the structure is fundamentally wrong. And so also my theory around cognitive functions is much more robust. Like, I can actually metaphysically talk with proper authority in some sense, or at least much more cogently about, how cognitive functions need to be understood in somewhat holistically, in philosophical terms and metaphysical terms. And this is also why MBTI is so popular, is because you have the tool set of the 8 cognitive functions, which is a bounded set. And so whenever you run up against a problem, you can just kind of lean on the cognitive functions and be more sophisticated about your understanding of how those cognitive functions interrelate to one another. And so you can kind of develop and unfold and expand because essentially it all rests on the substrate of the cognitive functions. The problem is that they are being used in a way in the MBTI dogma orthodoxy that essentially, that a dominant function and a parent function, or a dominant function and a secondary function, the parent is also sometimes called the secondary, must have opposite inflections. So if the dominant function is introverted, the parent function must be extroverted. That I break those rules because I have my 17 model of cognitive functions. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, this goes much smoother when I'm already talking to someone who is familiar with MBTI, or at least is half familiar also with 4 sides of the mind, that I can kind of jump through this stuff, but I'm kind of talking about it from a layperson's perspective. Anyway, so now each side of the mind has its own kind of unique challenge, because ontologically it is unique. Like the superego is in some sense the first side of the mind, but it's also just a floating parent function. And so it never gains consciousness. In some sense, it's like an imaginary figment in your head that you maybe start talking to, but as soon as the subconscious kind of gets the show on the road and you start developing the vanity, the dominant function in the subconscious, already you start to kind of, that superego floating parent function starts to blend into the background. Because in some sense, all it does is it gives you the free gift of your death and your lust, of the death and the child function in your subconscious. So you kind of, the subconscious is already gifted this child function. And in some sense also, the superego is very free to modulate that child function because it's just a floating parent function. So you can kind of, there's almost no limit in terms of how that child function can sort of be abused, or in some sense it's like a life hack. So the subconscious child function is like a life hack, and this is really the source of all the toxicity within the false ego complex. It's all to do with the unbridled nature of that lust. It's like it's sort of, anyway, I don't want to get too much into, I mean, I could quote a lot of sort of different religious things. I could quote from the Gita talking about the lust. Anyway, there are a lot of very simple things in Hindu philosophy which is quite interesting, but I usually end up completely relying on Christianity because that is the best description of how to deal with the ego. That essentially, if you want to properly get into Keegan stage 5, I use the crucifixion, and you'll see very clearly the Christ consciousness model of the crucifixion is essentially, I believe, the only way that you can transcend Keegan stage 4 and get into Keegan stage 5, and then it gets more complicated than that, and it's very much relying on revelations as inspiration to kind of orientate oneself. Anyway, so that's what I wish to get to. Okay, but so basically the subconscious, the theme of the subconscious is basically beliefs, right? So you all have beliefs, and you all have a kind of memory bank of beliefs, and the problem is that these beliefs are fundamentally toxic, and in some sense, usually the subconscious develops that realization itself in its parent function. Because eventually, like the subconscious by osmosis, when it develops enough wherewithal within itself, it ends up sort of stealing the secret power of the superego, and it kind of stores that secret power into its parent function. So the parent function in the subconscious kind of starts to displace the floating parent function in the superego. And then you kind of, the parent function is disaffected because it cannot safeguard its own child function, because leading on from the parent function is the inferior function, and the inferior function starts getting very traumatizing to the parent function, because the inferior function becomes the harbinger of the sin, and the sin is effectively the realization that that the child function has been sort of sacrificed, that the child function has not been redeemed, and the child function in a particular cycle of action has gone disowned, or has gone unexecuted, that the promise of the lust, symbolized by the lust, that the lust has proven to be inconsistent. And so essentially, in the interest of redemption, what the subconscious will do is it will the parent function in the subconscious will try to compartmentalize the inferior function and the sin, but specifically the inferior function, so that it can try to avoid the sin. So it wants to be sort of like Solomon, and it wants to cut the baby in half, the inferior function in half, because if it gives away all of the inferior function, then essentially it leaves the subconscious dormant, or at least sort of in a kind of in a stasis, in a frozen sort of tundra or whatever, of kind of being left behind. And I'm not going to be doing that. I'm not doing this recording well at all, because this requires me to have much more energy when I'm talking about this, because I'm going to, there's so many parallels here that are useful to talk about in some sense, because in a lot of ways this is archetypally symbolized by, I believe it was Abraham. This is so embarrassing if I even get the story wrong, but when God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, that would he give up his son for God? And then at the last minute he says, okay, no, your son can come off the sacrificial pyre. This is exactly the kind of the transition between the subconscious and the unconscious, that you have to be willing to give up all the value in your beliefs, in your subconscious. You have to be willing to kind of upload that into your unconscious, because the subconscious is so poisonous, and it's not really possible for it to, you can't get underneath the subconscious and fix the superego. If you do that, you are basically, you've got an unjustified enlightenment. So many people that are enlightened, and even from when they reach Kegan stage 4, then they reach all the way back down and they manhandle their subconscious and their superego, because they haven't found a way to actually redeem the subconscious. That's the biggest problem in spiritual life in some senses. How do we gain the safe use of our beliefs? Because essentially the problem with belief is that they always break in terms of context. And I'll tell you that the final solution in some sense is on this question, is that you need to repartition the four sides of the mind, where basically the unconscious becomes, Kegan stage 3 actually becomes the grounding of the four sides of the mind. So, and I haven't even spoken fully about the transition between the subconscious and the unconscious, but essentially the unconscious becomes a new birth. That you get rebirthed into the water. The water is symbolized, at least in the same way that you can model the four sides of the mind into the divided line. That the first side of the mind is the superego, the second is the subconscious, the second segment of the divided line, the third segment of the divided line is the unconscious, and the last is the ego. The greater of the greater is the ego. So the point here, is that the principled part of the divided line, the third segment, becomes the principia, the first place. The unconscious side of the mind must become the first place. The ego becomes the second place, which is why it must also eventually become static. So I think Plato was essentially right that you see, people that want to keep the fourth, people that want to keep the ego fluid in some sense, they don't properly understand the transition and the repartitioning between Kegan stage 4 and Kegan stage 5. They are in a kind of 4.5 that keeps its fluidity, or at least the pretense of a Kegan stage 5, because it's sort of it's manhandling itself in order to allow maximum variation in how you participate with other people externally. So they're kind of giving up their self-truth into a kind of nebulous state, so that they can kind of attain towards, let's say, a static culture, instead of allowing the fourth side of the mind, the ego, the systematicity side of the mind, of how you play your role, instead of making that static. They don't want a static role, so that they can sort of say that they're being Kegan stage 5. But anyway, so I'm kind of jumping the gun a bit. So in some sense then you realize that the real problem, sorry, I'm still talking above the actual beyond the actual flow of these subjects, but the real transition between these sides of the mind, between these Kegan stages, is that there are certain gateway filters between the sides of the mind. And so the first gateway filter, which is the most toxic, which in some sense only gets fully resolved once you are in the midst of going from Kegan stage 4 to Kegan stage 5, is what I call the Narcissism gateway filter, which is the connection between Kegan stage 2 and Kegan stage 3, between the subconscious and the unconscious, which is something between the portal on each side of that gateway, is the parent function in the subconscious and the dominant function in the unconscious. But the dominant function in the unconscious is also then further complicated by the nature of the unconscious itself, because it also has this potential to be a new starting point, a new starting place, a new first place. And so it has this hold over from, because in some sense the formula that it's useful to take the unconscious as the new starting point is really part of the burgeoning kind of development of between Kegan stage 4 and Kegan stage 5. And this is something, in some sense, that is only revisited on the other stage, very close to the end of reaching Kegan stage 5. You will go back and fully clean this up. But in principle, it is necessary to know how to stabilize the partition between stage 2 and stage 3. And so you must kind of have a mystery tradition, you have to have a mystery school, you have to have some kind of metaphysical understanding that the third side of the mind will become the first place, will become the place of first things, the principia. Anyway, I guess I'm just sort of repeating myself. Now, the unconscious side of the mind is where karma is, because in some sense the unconscious side of the mind is called the unconscious, but I could also call it the feeling body or something like that, or maybe even the social body. It is contextualized by you have to make circuitry within yourself that you see how you within yourself function, how your own internal wiring is kind of, which includes the ego. The unconscious, you see, this is the weird thing, is that the unconscious side of the mind fundamentally touches a bit of everything. It doesn't touch, I believe, the superego, but it does kind of, it takes things from the subconscious and it conflates them with things in the unconscious, and it maybe even touches on a few things in the ego. And so it kind of, it makes a little condensed version of yourself, and it does this at the cost of kind of welding things together quite badly. So you end up with fixed internal relations between your you end up sorry, I'm just trying to think of the word here. You end up maiming your metatype. You end up maiming, like, so everything is getting mixed up into fixed internal circuitry. Now, this fixed internal circuitry sort of follows the pattern of what I call emotional tones, and emotional tones are literally just defined as cognitive inflections. They all are reducible to the cognitive functions, which means that you can see them alive in the metatype. So in some sense, it's a cross-wiring of your metatype to create a shorthand, in some sense, that allows you, in some sense, probably to follow the formula, the general formula of, I'm not describing this well, but essentially there is something called a prime death, which is essentially the death of the subconscious. Death here doesn't mean that you are a human being that has a heart that is stopping beating. Death means the death of a cognitive function that corresponds to the dimension of psychological operation that corresponds to death in the metatype, and the prime death is the death in the subconscious. So basically, the death in the subconscious could also be seen as the contract with the false prophet, with the floating parent function and the superego. And so, in some sense, the subconscious gets to decide its own fate, because it gets to, in some sense, write its own contract. So, in some sense, the prime death is the subconscious. Is the abuse of a dimension of psychological reality, is an abuse of a particular cognitive function that corresponds to the form of promises receiving the form of promises that are received from the false prophet. So in some sense, the contract is required in order for the subconscious to receive the child function. So in some sense, the death and the lust both come from the floating parent function in the superego. And this is the problem, is that the source of your identity, in some sense, is that floating parent function. And because itself, it has no integrity, because it's just a floating parent function, it in some sense, the subconscious is fully to blame. I mean, it is and it isn't. It is in an epistemological sense. In some sense, in an ontological sense, it's not. Because I do actually think that this all is necessary. The false ego complex is a necessary development of the psyche, because and that'll become clear when I describe Keegan stage 5, essentially, as to the missing structures. But essentially, the false prophet is also essentially the knowledge, the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, is another way of looking at it. And the fruit of that tree, which is being constantly fed to the subconscious in the death and the lust. What's the point here? Is that okay, well, anyway, so that prime death is kind of like the inspiration for the metagram circuitry. So at some point, so this is sort of as the child is maybe getting 8 years old, 9 years old, they have to do this conversion work, and they almost have to be left, they have to leave themselves to free reign, a bit. They have to, you have to have a robust enough subconscious so that you can actually have a decent conversion from the subconscious to the unconscious, because you end up having to kind of, again, like the parent function in the subconscious is somewhat going to be absorbing the sort of the role of the superego. In some sense, the seed of the unconscious side of the mind is kind of this visionary projection from the parent function in the subconscious, which has synthesized the flaw in the subconscious, because the subconscious is self-defeating because it has an inferior function and a sin, and so obviously it's self-defeating, and the parent function is trying to make a peace deal, it's trying to make a kind of an armistice, and so it ends up kind of abrogating to itself the function of the false prophets itself. So the parent function in the subconscious sort of inherits the role of the false prophet, and it must do so in order to create a nice independent unconscious. And that whole situation needs to be redeemed later on. In some sense, it can be resolved, but it needs to be resolved not from directly fixing the subconscious and adding beliefs. You can't try to make your beliefs good by adding new beliefs. You have to understand the proper context, and that proper context only comes from proper recontextualization, not inventing good heuristics, essentially. And so, because if you end up creating good heuristics, then you basically have a dirty narcissism gateway filter between Keegan stage 2 and Keegan stage 3. So your 2.5 gateway filter essentially is, look, it'll always be toxic. Because in this metamorphosis period, even if you are going for a Keegan stage 5, right? So this is the thing, is that I do actually think that the status of Keegan stage 5 needs to be properly understood. And I do actually think that Keegan probably believes, if he believes that 1% of the population, or even 0.1% of the population have reached Keegan stage 5, I think he's incorrect. I think it's actually much rarer than he thinks it is. And although there might be better echelons of health within Keegan stage 4, that because I mean, even people in the East, Satguru, or even Osho himself, I would argue, were not Keegan stage 5. That they found a way to kind of stem all the toxicity in their subconscious, but they didn't do so going up through the top. They did so reaching back down, essentially. And in some sense, I would even argue that they were still enlightened, but they didn't understand their own enlightenment. And I think that if they did do it the right way, they would have been able to actually explain the process rather than in an experiential sort of issue. And in some sense, the real problem with them is that they can't actually share that in a culture. They're almost waiting for death because everything is as it should be, or something like that. So they don't have a proper integration of all these other sides of the mind. They don't end up sort of reclaiming and redeeming the subconscious from its toxicity, but in some sense it's inheriting that toxicity from the superego. And so again, they don't fix their superegos. They don't reform their superegos. They just kind of work out how to manage the toxicity, the source of the toxicity in the superego, but they don't sort of bring it back into the fold. Anyway, okay, so I didn't continue describe. Let me try to give a more proper description of the superego. Sorry, of the unconscious. So the unconscious, more importantly, the circuitry that you're actually using in the unconscious, although it's inside of your metatype, it's inside of your false ego complex, it's inside of these component parts that come from all these different sides of the mind. The connections, the wiring between those things are generic and are used by other people. So in some sense, you're using cognitive inflections, cognitive spins, and I do have a mapped out thing of all these sorts of things, of these types of circuitries. The problem is that people they're not aware of their full circuitry. They don't like using their full circuitry because the last two parts of that circuitry are again the trial and the sin. And they don't like realizing that their unconscious itself is fundamentally defective, because then you have to kind of be ego focused. You have to live in your ego, but then you still are always connected to this kind of toxic unconsciousness which you need in order to relate to other people. So, how you communicate with other people is through your unconscious circuitry. So it's indispensable, but it's also fundamentally sort of toxic as well. Although it's toxic for a different reason. It's toxic usually because you cannot delineate who is who, because you're using the same cognitive inflections that other people are using generically, and so they are fundamentally generic component parts. And so you're just a cog in the machine, and that's why it's the unconscious mind, because you're part of a system that has been alive for longer than you have been alive. And so how to delineate where your boundary begins of your responsibility, of your ego, of yourself, so the kind of the problem of conflation, and this in some sense is the biggest sign that someone is not Kegan stage 5, is that they don't know how to draw the line, and they are sort of, and it's true that to some degree that's an unfinished sort of, you have to be open that you might be wrong, that you need to assimilate more information to come to a better conclusion, but you need to have you need to be able to defend, you need to have a kind of rigorousness that you're not shy in sort of, and in some sense, and how people defend as well is a tell that they're not Kegan stage 5, because in some sense they're not able to have a respectful, thorough, deep, incisive, kind of clash on that level. They can't keep it condensed to the topic itself. It spills out in some sense, but I mean sometimes things need to spill out into other subjects because things are complicated and interconnected. And so, obviously you need to track all these things, but then you basically, I mean, what I would describe is the characteristic of being trapped in Kegan stage 3, which is in some sense what I think I would even call, when you are really at a Kegan stage 4.5, I would actually describe that is that you have a holdover in Kegan stage 3, because between your two gateways there are like two mirrors, and they are mirroring each other. And when you've got a mirror mirroring another mirror, you've got essentially an infinity tunnel. If you've ever put two mirrors in parallel, opposed to each other, then between them, it looks like you've created a little infinity tunnel of infinite space, so you think you're in Kegan stage 4 because you've created a kind of a recurring, a recursive, sort of intractability within Kegan stage 3, and then you've given yourself that play to toy with. You've given yourself. Anyway, I phrased that poorly, but I think the concept is fairly obvious. Now, the second gateway filter is what I call the borderline gateway filter, which is what I would call 3.5, and that is the transition between the unconscious and the ego. And the best way that I can think of to encourage people to do this is just the thought experiment. Imagine you woke up with no memory, and then you had to kind of piece together your role in present time from postulates from the ground up. And be as careful as you can, and don't use generalizations and social reductionism, or sociological reductionism, or statistical reductionism. So, I mean, this is the biggest problem, that I think that people that they depend on narrative. They don't realize that they're actually just kind of, they've got a naive narcissism sort of multiplying itself infinitely with a kind of, because in some sense, whatever dirt is on the narcissistic gateway filter, the borderline gateway filter is not going to be square. It's not going to be a square portal. It's going to be misshapen. The squareness of or the size is going to kind of be whatever extra dirt is on the narcissism gateway filter is going to generally be projected onto other people's narcissism, essentially. So this is the fundamental problem, and why the unconscious side of the mind is fundamentally problematic or toxic, is because you can't really know, is it your borderline personality tendency, or is it your dirty borderline gateway filter, or is it somebody else's dirty narcissism? So, this is the problem, is that that's almost an exact kind of trade-off. And the only way to kind of stabilize that is to, be high in have a high level of morality and self-determinism and self-consciousness, or whatever. I mean, Mark Passio, I think, is actually a very good, if you listen to angry Mark Passio with his dark tone of knowledge and wisdom, if you can actually put up and goes, oh, he's not being kind enough, he's not being positive enough, I mean, I might disagree with some of the semantics of how he expresses things or whatever, but I think that eminently there is a lot of value in just even the personability of how Mark Passio, that is his golden circuitry to some degree. I mean, I think he's much further along than other people. He's much more embodied. He's much more holistic. Anyway. So there's this problem in which the world of the unconscious side of the mind will always, want you to be confused about delineating responsibility and delineating, apportioning a kind of a justified substantiation. Because if you are just, it wants you to conform, it wants you to be projected on or whatever. I mean, as a general sort of tendency, it wants you to join a club. It wants you to be a legion with others, in some sense, to huddle together as a So these are the kind of lowest common denominator tendencies within the unconscious side of the mind. Karma is another way of talking about this. The unconscious side of the mind is pure karma, and you are adding to the karma. When I say adding, I mean hopefully you're transcendentally adding, or you hope to at some point transcendentally add to the karma. That essentially, I don't think we ever overcome the unconscious side of the mind, but we do in some sense get a golden circuitry, because we understand ourselves well enough that we don't have a kind of internal sort of lapse in deliberation that we have. But you see, to not have a lapse in deliberation and to claim that you're being transcendental on the level of the unconscious, I would say you have to have a static actualized role within your ego in some sense. And so obviously that's a tall order, and that is also only properly attained after Kegan stage 5. But you have to kind of have the hope that it's possible, and to some degree that's also the hope that we can all attain towards a single faith. Because if you don't kind of believe that there is something that can be shared as a kind of objective morality, which is kind of like the stand-in of an objective truth. Like, I would agree that an objective truth in the empirical sense doesn't exist, but an objective truth as a moral kind of claim, I think that we can all say mistakes will always be possible, but errors, we can expect not to be prone to error. We can hope that, we can have the faith that we should, if we all attained to the correct faith and the right faith, that we would not be error prone, but essentially mistakes would still happen. And a mistake and an error is not the same thing. And so in the one, a mistake, you can concede that a mistake was made and not concede the fact that your integrity, that your dignity has been besmirched because you did not make an error in some sense. You were perfectly coherent and consistent, whatever. Anyway, I don't want to pontificate about rounding all the edges of that kind of claim, but I think I think people can hopefully imagine how that can all work out. It's not that hard, I would posit as well, but it perhaps does need, as a pedagogical sort of thing, I could. But anyway, I don't want to be derailed. So. Okay, now what's the problem with Kegan stage 4? The problem with Kegan stage 4, when you're in the ego, is that people don't like their ego, because when you get to the... Okay, first of all, the dominant function in the ego, the parent function, the inferior function, and the sin in the ego are all actually what you think in real time. You think through those cognitive functions are the freedom that you have in your own mind. In some sense, it's sometimes very hard for people to know what those cognitive functions are. First of all, perhaps because of the weakness of slightly the weakness of the knowledge of cognitive functions in MBTI, but also because you usually look at your architecture, because your architecture you can't change. You look at your metagram circuitry, and perhaps you look at some of the metatype themes. Well, obviously the metatype themes are somewhat built inside of the metagram circuitry. So that's what you can see. That's your architecture. So you think, oh, those are my cognitive functions. But actually, how you are emulating those cognitive functions are actually what you're doing in real time, all the time, in the particular drama of your ego. And often that freedom of thinking is mostly de-emphasized by the architecture, which is overbearing, which is in some sense, the state of most people being in Kegan stage 3. And I've even said that people that even have some use of Kegan stage 4 are still pretty much in Kegan stage 3 to some degree, or at least are kind of have hang-ups over the 3.5 borderline gateway filter. And in some sense, what is happening is between the two mirrors within the unconscious, because there's, I should have gone into other descriptions as well, that they're stuck in a drama. There's a cycle of drama there. Also because you won't really take responsibility for all of your circuitry, because there's the last two stages of that circuitry, you just kind of incline yourself towards the middle bits. And in some sense, the last two stages are only properly taken care of when you're actually crucifying your ego. It's only resolved by the inferior function in your ego. Anyway, I'm going to have to get back to this. Okay, I'm just continuing this recording after a long break, so I just need to situate myself in what I was talking about. So I think I was still talking about the unconscious and the ego, and talking about the uniqueness of each side of the mind, especially in the context of the repartitioning that happens in stage 5. You kind of already have to prepare for that, otherwise you don't deal with each side of the mind, with each Kegan stage, properly enough that it can be cleaned up when you're trying to migrate from 4 to 5. And I was getting into the complexities of the unconscious side of the mind, the idea that essentially because you are interfacing in the unconscious in a very generic way, it's very hard to kind of be able to instantiate yourself or individuate yourself in a way that is justifiable and defensible in some sense. And that is, in some sense, a kind of a greater metaphysical problem that can only be fully cleaned up by stage 5. And essentially, I was trying to talk about, let's say, the faux versions of stage 5, the kind of the how pretenders, and I don't mean this with great negative connotation, but essentially the pretense of, let's just say, false enlightenment or something like that, or unjustified enlightenment, you see, this can be forgivable because in some sense this is part of the journey, but the idea that somehow you need to perfect your beliefs because, or that your beliefs are kind of static without a kind of contextual understanding that is applied to it from the unconscious. So there is a kind of context that can only principles, that only the rationale of the third segment of the divided line, the unconscious, needs to be golden in its circuitry to some extent, that it has confidence in how it interfaces with the world, which in some sense means that you have to understand enough about internal psychology as a general sort of topic, because otherwise you don't know where you end and the world begins, something like that. And you're going to sort of go down rabbit holes which are going to be fundamentally insoluble, because you're going to be conflating things that you don't know how to distinguish between, something like that. And this essentially gets baked into it because you end up developing toxic beliefs or relying on toxic beliefs that dogmatically fill in the gaps, essentially. And so you end up creating or concocting a set of beliefs that are actually sort of overextensions that help sort of steel man the rest of your psychology or whatever in the other sides of the mind. And so you end up with a very flip-flopped sort of ego in order to kind of steel man your own subconscious, when the subconscious needs to be redeemed in a much more robust and vigorous and methodical sort of thing that has, that dots all the I's and tittles all the T's. So okay, so I guess I'll start. I went into a metaphor about the ego, about how okay, still recording. I went into a metaphor about the ego, about how to kind of, in some sense, show the power of the ego. I mean, in some sense, push. In some sense, the reset button on the ego is, in some sense, when I use that example, it's a good way to kind of reignite the flame of the ego coming out of the unconscious side of the mind, because generally everyone has at least had a taste of the ego, and then they've slunk back into their unconscious side of the mind. They've slunked back into usually when you enter the unconscious side of the mind, at some point you go through a whole cycle of your metagram circuitry, and then you realize how sort of fundamentally inane it is. You realize how futile it is, that you're just kind of subjecting yourself to this kind of eternal drama, that you have this kind of infernal fatalism that is on replay, and you're going through the same drama in your life, but maybe you're kind of passing it off on yourself, that you don't realize that it's the same pattern, but it's just sort of with different sets of characters. And so, you're kind of like, you're trying to stabilize yourself in your unconscious circuitry between the two mirrors, of the two gateway filters. And you're kind of, you've got this attention unit, which is kind of being reflected between those two gateways, which are acting like mirrors. Now, and then you think that, well, because I'm so excitable because I have, in some sense, I've been reflected between these two mirrors. I count myself a king of infinite space, even though I've been bound in the nutshell in Kegan stage 3. And so what ends up happening is, because also you've slunk back to Kegan stage 3 from Kegan stage 4 through the borderline gateway filter between the unconscious and the ego, then effectively what's happening is you've got a secondary unit of attention, which is like a tentacle that is reaching from Kegan stage 3, from between those two mirrors, that infinity parallel sort of thing. You've got this monstrous tentacle that is puppeting Kegan stage 4. So you've got a presence in stage 3 and stage 4, and something of that presence is a bit of a mirror of the narcissistic gateway filter, the dirt on the narcissistic gateway filter, but in some sense it's independently established on the borderline gateway between the unconscious and the ego. So in some sense you end up projecting onto other people narcissism in order to essentially save your inverted borderline gateway filter, which is misshapen. So you haven't cleanly traversed what I call the gateway filter, which is like the 3.5 transition from the unconscious to the ego. Now, in some sense, that will, because we are prone to make mistakes always, we can never avoid mistakes, but we can avoid errors. But because we can always make mistakes, in some sense, you have to be sensitive to attuning yourself to other people's gateway filter. You have to come into a single faith, into a single, let's say, culture of communication and style of attaining to a one faith or something like that, which is in some sense it's not just a kind of a status that you achieve, it's a status that you also are in the pursuit of all the time. You are actively doing it. It's like an infinitive, and in some sense that's part of the crucifying of the stage 4, that the ego itself does need to get into a static crucifying of itself. And so that kind of consciousness, and I can specifically talk about the mechanics of it, but anyway, so I do think that Plato and a lot of philosophy around that is right, is that the systematicity of the ego does need to become a static state, whereas the other people who have the pseudo or fake Kegan stage 5, they think that they are going to have gold beliefs. They think that the greater of the lesser is going to become golden. They're going to have a golden understanding. And although I can half agree with that, because I do think that you can essentially have a golden via negativa understanding, that the understanding in the greater of the lesser, in the subconscious, does kind of synthesize a via negativa. And so you can kind of accumulate that. You can grow in your understanding always, but it will be the same quality of understanding. That the essence of it will be the same. And this is somewhat symbolized by introverted feeling, that in some sense, this is because the context of the understanding is already grounded by the unconscious, which becomes the first place, which becomes the ground of the rebirth. In the same way that the greater of the lesser, the lesser of the greater, the third segment of the divided line, at least in the alchemical sense, the first segment is earth, the second segment is fire, the third segment is water, and the fourth segment is air. But anyway, so that's an interesting, I guess, correlation between the Christian baptism and Platonic metaphysics, I would say. Anyway, so now, okay, so I haven't perhaps as delicately as I should have gone through all of the aspects of, the bookends of each of these things. That, obviously, it is more complicated to extricate yourself from metagram unconscious circuitry, because in some sense, the metagram, or the Kegan stage 3, is of a different nature to Kegan stage 2 and even to Kegan stage 4. It is more dynamic, fundamentally. And in some sense, it kind of has two, it within itself has two separate parent functions in a way, because the metagram, there'll be a metagram circuit. Within the metagram circuit, there'll be an emotional tone which corresponds to to the parent function in the unconscious side of the mind. And then there'll be a kind of metatype sort of terminal, which is also the parent function. And both of these things are also the parent function in a kind of confusion with each other. And so there are two things that have to kind of agree in order to have a clean transition. But in some sense, you can only understand this in principle, and it'll only become properly, let's say, ordered after you're already sort of doing the work of Kegan stage 5. So so the access to start doing the work of Kegan stage 5 is the crucifixion, essentially, which is that in your ego now you've got, and I was trying to speak about how you have these 4 functions, which are essentially what is literally in your head in the present time to think with freely, which is often occupied and sort of being displaced or being misted over by the unconscious circuitry and by essentially trying to have your frame of reference grounded in the unconsciousness. And the more that the ego can kind of seemingly direct the unconscious, or at least create things within the unconscious realm, you are growing in your ability in some sense to transcend karma, and you're growing in self-determinism and responsibility, stuff like that. And there's something useful in that thing that I said, that you wake up as if you had no memory. How easily would you be able to repostulate all of your kind of principles and all of your evaluations about, the society that you live in? Or perhaps you shouldn't be thinking on such generalizable, nebulous sort of things. You should sort of build it in a more humble way from, like, as a person relating to these things. And in some sense, even that context is very poisonous, because in some sense you'll say, like, why doesn't the government adopt me better? Why am I not better treated by my government, rather than why didn't my parents educate me, like work out causally what is missing in the system and what kind of keeps things vital, or something like that, But anyway, there's this huge amount of abrogated responsibility that ends up becoming a kind of a self-fulfilling doom spiral, or something like that. The idea that we need some kind of lowest common denominator rehabilitative solution to the problem locks us into sort of freezing this problem solution into a kind of cultural settlement. But anyway, and then you end up with a kind of with a half-baked sort of unconscious culture that has this kind of mark of the sympathy sort of entrenched inside of it. And then you have this trade-off between sympathy and sustainability in terms of just having very weak and invalidated egos instead of static egos that are stable in themselves. Now, how you reach that stability, and I know that this will seem impossible, is because the inferior function in the ego is very, very toxic to the ego, because it leads on to the sin of the ego. And you really don't want to see the sin of the ego, because unlike every other side of the mind, the ego doesn't have a next side of the mind to pass the baton onto. Every other side of the mind could pass the buck into a new entity, but there are no new entities. The ego is the last side of the mind. Kegan stage 5 is only accessible because you take 100% responsibility on yourself for the problem that you see in the world, essentially. So your parent function is like your fleshly thinking, and you have to be able to sacrifice the thinking in your parent function in your ego. So in some sense, you have to let your parent function take the pain of the inferior function in your ego. And this is very much archetypally explored very nicely by the crucifixion itself. I can give the example in my psychology, in my type of my metatype. But essentially, the fleshly thinking in my metatype is actually the first dimension of psychological reality, is FE, extroverted feeling, and that's a kind of the long form of FE is what will be, or I also call it instinct. So you have an instinct about what will be, a certain set of expectations. So you have to be able to kind of let your expectations be punished by the torture of the inferior function. The inferior function here would be introverted feeling. So my inferior function of my ego is introverted feeling, and that corresponds to a kind of aware of darkness and an outside authority in retrospect. So so in some sense it's very sort of archetypal of a kind of a map of understanding of things. But so how the metaphor of the crucifixion doesn't work that well, because this is so sort of internal and psychological. But essentially, the inferior function, you have to endure the torture of your inferior function in silence. Like, this is somewhat archetypally expressed because Jesus was silent before his accusers. He did not respond to the charges put against him. So he was witnessing the torture of his inferior function. He was witnessing the torture of his awareness of darkness, that he was in some sense letting it happen to him. And in some sense, he could see where this is going to, but he was willing to sacrifice what will be. So he was willing to take the pain on his fleshly thinking of what will be, and he is willing to just silently, you see, the inferior function is kind of, it's not swallowing itself into suppressing itself, it's just not expressing itself, but it's still active. So the inferior function is what is actually the source of the trauma, the trial. You're enduring this trial to that cognitive function of FI. So you don't switch these things off. You're letting your experience of FI, of other people's FI, you're kind of witnessing other people's FI, and you're letting it sacrifice your fleshly thinking. But in some sense, that's because you know that you're in disagreement. Your inferior function is in stark disagreement. That is the torture, is that your inferior function is in stark disagreement in terms of other people, in terms of other people's sensibility in some sense. So in contradistinction with your inferior function, their inferior function doesn't function. Okay, now so you have to hold that pain in your own body, hold that torture in your own body. That is essentially the crucifixion. Then the sin is the emergent missing of the mark, the missing of the target. Well, no, missing of the mark. So essentially, the sin is something that then you share in, because you were complicit by your silence. So you didn't argue with it. So you have an argument with it, but you don't make the argument. You're silent before your accusers. You let it happen, and therefore you become part of the sin. You engage yourself in the sin. You become complicit in the sin. You take it upon yourself. You absorb it, and therefore you gain ownership over it. So how this is accomplished, essentially, in practice, is that when Jesus is on the cross, he's been crossed by these people, but he accepts the cross himself. He in fact doesn't just accept that they have done it to him, he accepts that he has done it to himself. He says on the cross with his words, he doesn't talk to the people that have done this to him, he talks to God, and he says to God, "Why have you forsaken me?" He says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" So when he's talking to God on his own behalf, he is owning the crucifixion. He's owning the sin of the world. He is taking responsibility for what they have done to him, because he's saying, I've done it to myself. And he's done that because his inferior function was silent before his accusation. So he is in disagreement to it, but he swallows that disagreement. He swallows that disagreement, and he dies to the sin of the world. And the sin of the world dies to him, I guess, or it's hard to kind of describe it. Essentially, you have to understand that the first day of the grave, in the crucifixion, that Jesus is resurrected on the third day. The Christ consciousness is resurrected on the third day. So the first day is actually the day of the crucifixion. The sin of the world becomes dead because of accepting ownership and being silent before your accusers in relation to the inferior function. So the emergent sin of the world becomes a mixture of both yourself and the world, but you take 100% responsibility for it. That's the Christ consciousness. And then you become dead to the sin of the world. You die to the sin of the world. Both of those things are sort of true or whatever. But so the sin of your ego is also the death of the superego. This is the mismatch in the four sides of the mind, is that in each other side of the mind, there was actually an overlap, a connection between the two sides of the mind. But the overlap between the ego and the superego does have an overlap, but in some sense it's a very virtual one, because the superego is a floating parent function. It doesn't have anything below it. So it doesn't have a death, it doesn't have a child function, it doesn't have a dominant function, it just has a floating parent function. But the sin of the ego actually occupies the same cognitive function as the death of the superego if it had a death, but it never had a death because it's a floating parent function ontologically. So now, through the epistemological power of the ego, doing something in present time, doing an activity, doing this, let's say, this ritual, but is an alchemy of your own cognitive functions, you are performing, by taking 100% responsibility for the emergent sin in the world, you are crucifying your ego. And that is something, the ego must always be crucifying itself. It reaches that static point. And the sin of the ego is the death of the superego. So that's the first day in the grave. Then the second day in the grave is the child function of the superego. And that you must make sure you mustn't resurrect too early. You mustn't resurrect on the second day. You have to wait in your grave after the crucifixion. Do not try to create a structure in the superego child function. If you create a lust in your superego will become supercharged, and you'll become like a demigod. You will sort of you'll kind of take on a valence of the god of the world. You'll have a psychotic episode. I need to talk about this because this is slightly dangerous for some people. My theory does need to build on itself or something like that, and teach therapists how to bring people through this perhaps. But essentially, if some people have metagram circuitry, which essentially makes them prone to bipolar type 1, if they have only ever explored one side of their circuitry and the other side of their circuitry remains latent, it will be impossible not to, well, I don't want to get too sidetracked by this, but essentially, if you try and go from Kegan stage 4 crucifixion to Kegan stage 5, you'll end up supercharging the other circuit, which was dormant until then. Because when you do the crucifixion and you start actually properly doing the proper healing of the superego, well, in some sense it's a reformation, because you're trying to develop structures there that never existed before in order to ground that false prophet, in order to put the false prophet into the lake of fire. And in some sense, how you do that is you create the New Jerusalem, which is basically the dominant function in the superego. And anyway, the revision between, I'm covering ground that I went in the last recording over, but the revision here is the understanding that basically the inferior function in the ego is in the same resonance as what the dominant function in the superego, those things need to add up. That the inferior function that received the torture of the crucifixion, that disagreement between the world and between yourself, that you were silent before your accusers, that is integrated and synthesized in the dominant function of the superego. That is the seed that is planted, that is the root system of the tree of life. And what becomes the tree of life is essentially what displaces the false prophet. So you're displacing the tree of the knowledge, or the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, with the tree of life. You're going back to the tree of life. And in some sense, it's the understanding of the world tree. It's a proper understanding of the spirit of man, because the ego has this technology of the crucifixion, where you can tolerate the sin of the world, and you end up developing the capacity to deal with it through your superego, which then feeds proper, nourishing things into your subconscious, and your subconscious takes on a completely new character, and you end up creating freedom within your subconscious, that your beliefs become metafluid, your subconscious becomes metafluid. Your Keegan stage 2 is actually becomes, in some sense, the new ego, but it's an ascended ego, and it's repartitioned and it's differently ordered from the old. This is the new personality, and this is the stable Keegan stage 5, that in some sense will always have a certain amount of problem in the world unless it has organizations in which this kind of integrity and this kind of correspondence and the need to attain to a single faith, not just something that's good enough, that works as a kind of as a stopgap. Anyway, I mean, so the New Jerusalem, which is the dominant function in the superego, then means that the parent function of the superego starts to create a more stable inferior function and sin, which in some sense isn't a sin anymore. Those two functions are something like the new heaven and the new earth, in that order. That the what was the death of the subconscious becomes the new heaven, and what was the lust or the child function of the subconscious that was being provided to it by that floating parent function, because it's no longer floating, that child function that the superego is giving to the subconscious is now the new earth. And then the dominant function of the subconscious and the parent function of the subconscious and the inferior function of the subconscious are all untethered. Those three things become free, they become fluid. And so you have a kind of mastery over contextualizing your own beliefs, in which you can actually channel the principia from the unconscious. So in some sense, you are grounding your perception, your opinions are grounded in the unconscious, and your beliefs are metafluid in terms of being stable. So in some sense, you are stable, you are operating in your field of context, which is stabilized by your metagram circuitry, which becomes a golden circuitry now, because in some sense you're using it to receive signal, and you are, in some constructive sense, maybe in some abstract sense, you are also using it to kind of have a certain maybe signal within karma, but you're not actually communicating on the level of karma. You're actually communicating on the level of the subconscious. So your seat of consciousness, in some sense, your ego, what was the ego, the role of the ego, is actually now repartitioned and migrated to the subconscious. Now, I mean, the wonderful thing about my theory is that, I've basically got, essentially, as long as I can type someone within my system, and I believe that I've got the description of every type of circuitry, and I've got essentially a metaphysical model of all the cognitive functions, which is effectively, essentially, a map of the heavens and the earth. I can kind of more accurately know what the problems are, or at least I should be able to reconcile a lot of my modeling with what perhaps has already been discovered within psychology or within some other systems of I should be able to kind of integrate these things to understand more mechanisms. But essentially, I mean, I've done all the heavy lifting. Essentially, I've got all the categories right, I believe. And I mean, basically, more obviously, I can describe specifically bipolar type 1, type 2. My models explain all these things. I think they're also very good at understanding the nature of the problem with certain things like ADHD, and which is probably very much to do with Kegan stage 3 or to do with what I've referred to as Kegan stage 2.5 and 3.5, that, borderline personality disorder and, these things are almost better referred to as cluster B personality disorders, are somewhat different kinds of, using those concepts, but also specifically using the understanding of metagram circuitry. You'll be able to more specifically diagnose these sorts of things, because you'll be able to more specifically say, okay, well, you're stuck in this part of your metagram circuitry and you haven't been able to have a full cycle of your metagram circuitry, because you kind of, in some sense, your metagram circuitry is always happening as well. So you can't push pause on it. So you kind of have to be able to do these things concurrently. Anyway, let me stop. I should probably just reattend to what I've just spoken about, just to clean up some things that might not be clear. So I think I'll deal with the subconscious first, and I'll talk about the unconscious second. That the liberation of the subconscious, or the detoxification of it and the reordering of it, because of the repartitioning, essentially is, in some sense, I think it's interesting that there are these almost, I wouldn't say blank spots, but there are these spots which kind of get blotted out, and in some sense, I think that they might, interestingly enough, conform to, anyway, I don't want to speculate too much about metagram circuitry and how these blank spots sort of seek to ameliorate those sorts of things, but in some sense there might be an interesting pattern and correlation between what I'm calling these blank spots, for example, in the resurrection, that you're waiting in the grave over the 3 days, the 3 days being 3 days in the calendar of these 17 cognitive functions. So, sorry, I'm saying a lot of things all at once. That might, in some sense, diffuse the toxicity in the mesogram circuitry, potentially. At least in the early parts of the circuitry, it might sort of defang, like, actually it wouldn't, because it wouldn't. No, actually, no. Mesogram circuitry does include sometimes things that are that are otherwise in line with the superego. So I guess for some people's types, it might end up, or that's an interesting thing to look up afterwards. But anyway, that's a clerical sort of thing that I'd have to look at when I've got better ways of modeling these personality, this data, because I have the data. It's quite raw, and if I were to construct a model, I'd have to do it by hand. And because there are 48 types, I'm just kind of lazy to look at all those interesting kind of technical, sort of to farm it for more kind of technical congruencies and things like that, and incongruencies, to get a more three-dimensional understanding of all the little mechanics involved when dealing with perhaps different types of cases that might be tricky in different ways. But anyway, that I was going to say that in some sense the ego is colonizing or annexing the child function of the superego, because essentially, because of the resurrection, the activity of the crucifixion, which really is centered around the inferior function and the ego, and also the parent function being a stress point that's being sacrificed. So the parent function is being sacrificed, and the inferior function is being tortured in the face of the sin, which is the next cognitive function, which in my type has to do with generalization in retrospect, and in the immediate it has to do with the awareness of multiplicity. Because in some sense,
the immediate, the problem is that because of the capability of forgiveness, that in some sense you can always find some way to kind of get around some things. So in some sense, the idea that you have to countenance any possible, derogation and abrogation or something like that, because you have that TI, the cognitive function that corresponds to my sin of my ego, is that form of introverted thinking that, in retrospect, from a starting point, is looking into the concept of the awareness of darkness and understanding that essentially how forgiveness works, to kind of change the state of an awareness of darkness, because it can be novated essentially. Um, well, it's not just, it can be altered as well, but forgiveness in that context is also a novation and an alteration, depending on which sequence you look at. If you look at the immediate sequence, or if you look at the retrospective referential sequence, because in some sense there are two threads of activity. There's the thread of activity in the past tense, or in the in some sense in the frame in which teleologically you are already surmising that you are doing it with some purpose in mind. Therefore, it's all relative to a teleological framework. Everything can be said already to be perfected, in the sense that it has been either accomplished or hasn't been accomplished. But obviously, when you have a purpose in mind, you can already refer to it in the present. Even you can even imagine it in some sense, in the state at which it would be completed. The final causation kind of frame of reference. Uh, and then you have the immediate sense in which you're still in the process of doing it in some sense, and in that immediate sense, it's always an infinitive. It's always essentially in the reference of a now time, in the present. It's happening in the present, and you are doing it in the present, and you're being responsible for it in the present, and you have to kind of, so you're already in the middle of it, even though you've got a frame of reference that you can depict in which it's already been completed. So in some sense, the purpose, the retrospective, precedes the immediate experiential participation of it. Anyway, so there are these two threads in each cognitive function. And so the sin of my ego is the idea that, well, because, and in some sense, the sin is specifically connected to the child function in the ego. Um, and because essentially there's the child function and the sin have three cognitive functions displacing them. So there goes the child function, the parent function, the inferior function. Sorry, I said it wrong. It's the child function, the dominant function, the parent function, the inferior function, and then the sin. So the child function and the sin are displaced by three intermediaries. And in the course of those three intermediaries, the sin appears in which the child function has been irredeemably, let's say, contradicted. That essentially, whatever the child function, this chain, this sequence, this chain, the cycle of action, which essentially was supposedly happening for the purposes of the child function, it turns out in the sin is impossible to accomplish. Performance becomes impossible. The execution of the will, as represented by the child function, becomes alienated in the reference of the sin. So the sin is a fallen state. And so, and then in some sense, if you don't, in some sense, work out how to sacrifice one of those intermediaries, you sacrifice the parent function, and you have to realize that the inferior function was telling you the truth. Because the inferior function comes just before the sin. There's dominant function, parent function, inferior function, sin. So you side with the inferior function and you sacrifice the parent function, and in some sense the seeds of all of these problems was in the dominant function, but in some sense the dominant function can't reform itself. It's already stuck in a cycle of action that was set off by the child function. So in some sense, if you really were to blame the root cause of anything, you would maybe blame the child function, but then you have to understand that the child function is in some sense a gift of the parent function of the last side of the mind that is trying to repurpose its sin as the next side of the mind's parent child function. So it's already been passed. It's past the parcel. It's the buck has been passed on to the next person. Where does the buck stop? Well, the buck needs to actually stop with the ego. So the inferior function of the ego becomes the control center of the rebirth in some sense. And how it rebirths itself, well, rebirth might be the wrong word. The resurrection is a better word. It actually has to be part of killing itself so that it dies to the sin of the world, or that it's dead to the sin of the world, that the inferior function becomes dead to the sin of the world because you have owned the sin. And in some sense, when Jesus says, Father, why have you forsaken me? He is accepting the torture of it. In some sense, you can imagine that he disagrees with what himself that he might be saying, that there's an inconsistency here, but he's not owning the inconsistency. He's owning the consistency that he's disowning his own fleshly thinking, and he's accepting it. He's living the accusation out, and he's owning the accusation against him by not arguing with it, by not disagreeing with it and giving the other side. And so when he does that, he's in some sense respecting the sin, because in some sense the sin is not wrong. The sin is proof that your way of thinking is toxic. But it's also not your fault that you're thinking in a toxic way, because this is like just the ontological thing that you're part of this process. You're part of the false ego complex, which I would even argue is kind of necessary. But if you don't kind of take responsibility for it, then you never get to a resolution in some sense. So you kind of, you have to bootstrap. That's what the crucifix is in some sense. It's a bootstrapping. But you have to want to do the bootstrapping, otherwise it doesn't work, is another way of kind of putting it. Anyway, because in some sense you actually have to do it before you see the effect of it. That's the most important thing, is that you actually have to be willing to do it. And then the reason comes afterwards. It doesn't precede. Give and it will be given. So it's this strange thing, is that you have to jump before you look, in this weird sort of sense, in terms of the crucifixion itself. And that requires faith, I guess. So and then essentially the crucifixion, I think, becomes naturally much more easier to stabilize, because in some sense you never stop crucifying. I die daily. Is one of the descriptions of the crucifixion in the scripture. It also says, it talks also in other books, that the death of Lord Jesus is bandied about in the body. That the death of Lord Jesus in the body, that is, they're not talking about somebody else. They're not talking about a vicarious redemption. They're talking about the death of their Jesus Christ, their Christ consciousness in the crucifying. I die daily. There's no vicarious redemption in the Christian scripture. It says, if you are a disciple of Jesus, pick up your cross and follow him. He shows the way. He doesn't do it for you. He just shows you the way how to do it. The only begotten Son is your mind, is the self-realization of your ego, the Christ consciousness. Anyway, so when you are dead to the sin of the world, when you have died to the sin of the world, and you wait in your grave, you are skipping over the child function of the superego, and you're only resurrecting on the day of the dominant function of the superego. And then in some sense, the dominant function of the superego will, if developed, if grown, if ordered, will be ordered in connection with the inferior function. So the inferior function is not discharging itself into the sin. It's not discharging itself into the child function of the superego. It's discharging itself into a manifestation, into an expression, into a structure that is the New Jerusalem in the dominant function of the superego. So that you will build a city where otherwise, in every other side of the mind, there is a vanity, but here there will be a New Jerusalem instead of a vanity. And in some sense, archetypally, you could say it is also rebuilt out of the brick and the mortar of the Babylon the Great, because perhaps the dominant function in the superego is archetypally Babylon the Great. Because it was just always the center of everything, the center of all power, and the blood of the saints were trapped in the mortar and the stonework of the great city of Babylon. So Babylon the Great is home of, you know, all the values and all the rich merchants and kings, and they are all drunk. They're all crazy. All the kings and rich merchants in Babylon the Great are wrath. They're angry, but they are drunk on the wrath. They are inebriated. They are literally out of their own minds, intoxicated, not out of the pleasure, but out of the anger that they get from fornication with the whore. That essentially there's a nebulous, the superego is based on a nebulousness between its unfinished structure, because it never had a death, it never had a child function, and it never had a dominant function. So instead it had the whore of Babylon, and it had Babylon the Great. And in some sense, all of its values were all mixed up in this fornication with the whore, which made them angry, and they were actually drunk on the anger. So they're frozen in this state of stasis, in this frozen war of values that have no order, because there's no integrity, because effectively the queen is not even called a queen, she's called the whore of Babylon. So they have all the value, they have all the power, but they have no integrity. That's the state of the superego. And then the floating parent function is just like Father Christmas handing out all these presents, and he doesn't care if you're naughty or nice. He just, cares if you can kind of concoct a letter saying what you want or something like that. Anyway, I'm not trying to put on Father Christmas and children, because I do think that whole dramatization of, that's important for subconsciouses to grow through, because each section of the life, each phase of development has its own particular. I mean, I wanted to get into the complexity of this, that essentially the subconscious, maybe it is a useful thing at some point in your development to think that the subconscious can be true, that your beliefs can be accurate, and that your computation around belief has a right answer. Like, because that's in order to explain the nuance of the fluidity and the contextualization of beliefs, is something that you can only even start to look at when you're going from Kegan stage 3 to Kegan stage 4. That's something that you have to resolve at that point. When you're a subconscious, when you're a young child, and when you're maybe a young child with one foot into the unconscious, that already is a bit too, well, I mean, within some contexts, within some presentations, there might be a safe way of kind of modeling that out to people. And in some sense, children have locked within them experiences in which they have planned out their own development in some sense, and then they forget about it because they get stuck into the actual, that motion of that side of the mind. It's a slog, it's to work through it. And in some sense, we don't always have the right models at the right time, but also we have misled ourselves, and we're following things, and we're mixing up things, and especially Kegan stage 3, essentially the unconscious side of the mind, is potentially, I mean, a lot of people I think never truly find their way through that. Usually they've had some experience with Kegan stage 4, but they can't stabilize it, not with the kind of unconscious content that they're sort of sitting with. Um, a lot of those things are complicated by extraneous matters that have to do with different species of metagram circuitry, and such, than the kinds of complications with, anyway, with particular ways in which the dominant function in the ego has become intoxicated or polluted in some sense. Because a lot of the time, the upper echelon of Kegan stage 4, the upper echelons of the ego, because the inferior function is so frightening, and you don't want to work out how to, the parent function wants to self preserve itself. And so the parent function colludes with the dominant function to just get the dominant function to just redirect all attention that might escape from Kegan stage 3 up into the parent function and maybe the inferior function. It just says, no, 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 just go back to the unconscious. Just go back to Kegan stage 3. The dominant function stands there like a kind of like a patrol border guard on the other side of the uh, borderline gateway filter. And in some sense, Kegan stage 3 has found a way to kind of bribe that border guard, and in some sense is also that bribery of the border guard allows for some theft of the power of Kegan stage 4 to be on the beck and call. I have a very good example where in one of my other recordings where I talk about the Wizard of Oz, where essentially the person behind the curtain is sort of Kegan stage 3, because in some sense that's all we are. We're behind a curtain, Kegan stage 3. That's our true footing. That's the principia. That's the first place. And I did want to expand on talking about the golden circuitry here, because in some sense the golden circuitry allows you to correspond with external circuitry in a very definitive way in knowing where the world ends and yourself begins. And that does require a certain education. I think that does require a certain understanding about psychology. Otherwise, you can't draw that line. You're going to be making moral generalizations and conflations, and you're going to have a very dirty borderline gateway, and you're going to project narcissism onto other people. Um, and like it is true that de facto you have to have an etiquette in which you concede that maybe you do have a Kegan stage 3.5 sort of misshapen gateway filter, but that's because you need to find a way to modulate with other people. But sometimes you don't just need to modulate with other people, you do need to actually see that there is a difference in faith, and you do need to like either hash that out or realize that there isn't enough integrity within the culture or whatever to be able to endure that. Um, or individual integrity to be able to endure that. And that will have something to do with, in some implicit sense, having beliefs in Kegan stage 2, which you're not willing to kind of recontextualize, or if you're only willing to recontextualize them, you've got sort of principles which are like fatty principles. They're like they're overcharged, and in some sense that's the 3.5 thing that's sort of reaching its tentacle out into Kegan stage 4 and puppeting Kegan stage 4 a bit, that you're playing both sides of the fence in order to prove your point. And in some sense the systematicity of Kegan stage 4, if it's not reached Kegan stage 5 yet, is fundamentally toxic, because Kegan stage 4 does not, it has to be static, is the best way that I can put it. The only way to make it static is something like that it's constantly crucifying itself. but it doesn't crucify itself in a way in which it doesn't know what it's doing, in that it has confidence that it is crucifying itself, and so it is capable of hashing things out in a respectable way, in a reasonable way, in some sense. And so, it is a kind of, this is problematic, because in some sense, the only way to judge any of these things is within the unconscious itself, and saying, well, actually, I think that you are not being responsible enough in the unconscious. And then maybe you can learn, maybe, oh, I was making a mistake. Maybe I can learn about that. Or maybe if you try to teach me about it, then I can tell you why I think that that teaching is substandard or doesn't apply in this particular circumstance, and then maybe you'll learn something about it. But in some sense, the whole thing is a mistake, more so than an error on anyone's part. So that's the weird sort of thing, that the etiquette of being sensitive to your own 3.5, the bell tolls for thee, as they say. But the problem is that if somebody else is so somewhat reticent to have that iron sharpening iron because it's not kind enough, it's not positive enough, or something like that, that essentially there's only one form of respectful discourse, or something like that, which is bounded within this very, I'll say, too light a touch in some sense, that you can only go yes and in some sense, perhaps that's because people don't have the skill and the tools to actually hash out differences of values and negotiate values and axiomatically sort of agree on some kind of basis that's capable of creating a bridge. In some sense, I think that the bridge itself that one person is using, well, they say, well, this is the maximally broad bridge, but it actually has gaping sort of holes in it. That in some sense it's sort of a lot of people might be able to make it through, but the people that fall through the holes are the people who actually, let's say, inspect the bridge and say that actually it's not, you can't just have a good enough bridge to get to stage 4, or in some sense a good enough bridge that gets you. Yeah, I mean, I guess this might be because essentially there's a fundamental disagreement about the content of stage 5, or about that in some sense the hole in this bridge is actually symbolic of the fact that there's a narcissism baked into this. There's a 2.5 dirty gateway filter between the subconscious and the unconscious, which is being braked into this too broad bridge, and that is being reflected in the fact that there's a hole in the bridge between Keegan stage 3 and Keegan stage 4, and then essentially the propaganda that you're actually able, because if you accept that bridge as being good enough, then that is also, and you proselytize based on that bridge, and you can scale up that bridge, then that gives you the idea that the sharing of that too broad a bridge that has holes in it is proof that you are in a stage 5 culture. And so it's, in some sense, you're saved by the collective, and you don't have and your individual understanding has holes in it, or something like that, or it's good enough. And I mean, in some sense, I do think that things can be good enough in that way, but the issue of holes, mending the holes and attaining to the one faith, I think that would be, at least in the metaphor that I've just described, the thing that actually you can't have too broad a bridge if it comes at the cost of the bridge having holes in it. And so I guess, the issue, does the bridge have a hole in it or not? Or is it just, no, it actually doesn't have a hole, it's just good enough. And some people, when they walk the bridge, it'll be good enough for them, but there'll be a hole in it in their subjective use of the bridge. But in some sense, that doesn't mean the bridge has a hole. It just means that, uh, um, they're doing, I think virtualism in some sense. I was talking about virtualism in my other recording, that in some sense, I would just add one thing to it, is that you have to have this idea that you can have an objective virtual moral schema that is in theory like the best, essentially. And the kind of the nebulousness and the almost tacit nihilism that I think that virtualism can be cast as will never be good enough, because essentially you will have fractious values that won't essentially be in alignment, and you'll end up creating a convention of metafluidity, which will, in some sense, make metafluidity on the individual scale, in the individual psychology, it won't be there. It'll be a kind of performative dramatization, and in some sense it'll only make sense within the context of the container, and in some sense I do think that is also the general proto-fascistic sort of unconsciousnesses, that oh, we'll just bestow high status on people. It doesn't matter if it's deserved or not. It's deserved because we all have the same identity or something like that. So it's like we're all just kind of generic enough, and we're different enough. And if we don't understand those differences well enough, then it doesn't matter or something like that, because we're worth it. It just evolves into more and more sort of oversimplified rhetoric and sort of weird kind of sympathy extraction, and with its weird sort of shadow of unsustainability, that it can't even conserve its own lack of integrity. In some sense, that's the problem, is that it's all founded on on the idea that you can just kind of fudge the concept of integrity. In some sense, that's the whole problem with this kind of nebulousness, moralizing, that it can just be good enough morality. It doesn't have to be objectively the best morality or something like that, or objectively justified, or objective justification as a category is just seen as abjectly impossible, or something like that, and that people don't orientate themselves towards that, which and they just settle. Look, in practice, something being relatively justified is what it looks like on Kegan stage 3. But on Kegan stage 4, you do actually get objective justification within your own self. To thy own self be true. And that gains you access into fixing your superego, which you can still mess up, and then the whole thing kind of becomes psychotic, probably. But, sorry, let me get this. So in some sense, it's to do with the definition of the end goal, in some sense. That if the end goal becomes this kind of nebulous, sort of gelatinous, oh, well, we'll all have the same status, rather than we'll all actually have the same justified understanding. We must have a true understanding, even if the understanding of our own understanding is essentially primordially a kind of via negativa, a bank of via negativa that is growing, but has the same quality and cogency of how it is. Anyway, there's so much propaganda for, like, oh, well, just lean into the moral panic, lean into the emergency that we just need to do anything or something. So I'm skating around it, and I've lost my thread something on this point. So let me just try to reach back to it. Is that the golden circuit in the unconscious, in some sense, will not be gold relative to other people's perspective. It'll look like iron to them, but relative to yourself, it must be gold, and you must be also able to justify it. You must be able to explain it, as it were, or to hash it out, or defend it, or something like that. So I do think that is the proof in the pudding, on the level of the individual, not in the level of effects, in the level of essentially the potency of the causative nature. And to some extent, that does require humbly admitting one's limitations. Like I say all the time, I might be wrong. That is something I truly believe, that I might be wrong. Principally, I might be mistaken. I might be mistaken in my beliefs. Show me a better form of believing, a better way of believing. but don't try to give me a set of beliefs, because in some sense I have categorically worked out that sets of beliefs are problematic. So you have to understand my critique about belief that needs to be in conjunction with context, which is in some sense provided by principles. So in some sense I do have this idea that principles are the first things, not beliefs. And so you'll have to disabuse me of that. And I'm putting that out there as a warning in some sense that, I mean, obviously don't try to sell me beliefs when that is already my metaphysical position. You're going to have to find out how to undermine that metaphysical position. I can't work out how to undermine it. I've wrestled with it incredibly carefully, and I don't think it can be broken. I mean, other than, sort of trying to drug me to death or physically kill me, and then so that I can't continue to say that, or maybe you can find out how to install electrodes, to kind of force me to talk, to say the wrong thing that I don't agree with. But I don't think that proves the point. Essentially, compulsion, if you make me say the opposite under absolute compulsion, as in you found a way to actually puppet my lungs and the movement and the muscles of my mouth so that I say the thing that I disagree with. In some sense, well, I mean, at that point, you're not trying to have discourse anyway, but you're not trying to use reason or values at that point. Um, you're just trying to win an argument, which, in some sense, I think proves my argument about how beliefs themselves are fundamentally toxic and they have to be contextualized by principle. And I do think that people perhaps also haven't had the same. I mean, obviously, none of us have necessarily been exposed to the same developmental line of collecting our principles, and somewhat our principles might also be a little bit orientated based on our particular metagram circuitry. So, some principles might need to be slightly differently expressed, but also structured in order to kind of attain to the same understanding that we might actualize, or in terms of the actual conscious apperception of the principles, there might be different systems of recall and alignment, or instantiation, and because in some sense we all will have a different constitution in our ego, and to put it bluntly, we have a different inferior function in the ego, and we'll have a different parent function in the ego, at least 17 different species. And obviously, if you add in the complexity of metagram circuitry, then we also understand that we are transitioning from metagram circuitry to trying to crucify the ego. And that transition is going to be facilitated by perhaps a slightly different recipe of way of sort of purveying, or having the principles pervade to you. But I do think that the quality of the reception of that, and the activation of the technology of the crucifixion by the inferior function, essentially, is going to be a is going to be of the same quality, of the same condition of the ego, especially when it is constructing the New Jerusalem, essentially the dominant function in the superego, which has this very. So the inferior function then goes to the sin. So it only skips two, I guess. Because it goes from the sin is the first day of being dead in the grave, dead to the sin. The second day is the death of the super. Sorry. That the sin is also the death, because sorry. and then the second day is the lust or the child function of the superego, which is still dead. And then the third day, you're risen on the third day. Risen on the third day is the dominant function. And so the inferior function and the dominant function only have two functions in between them as intermediaries. And so when that inferior function is structuring and aligning itself, that when the crucifixion, the torture of the crucifixion, the disagreement that endured that torture and that died to the sin of the world, that witnessed that, is acclimatizing itself into the programming of the construction of a city that has glass roads and trees that have, I can't remember, it's like 1,000 of every 12 fruit or something like that, and the water of life that flows in the city, in its aquifers or whatever, that have these minerals that are is like the water of life in the New Jerusalem. That in some sense that is the reclamation of the values, the blood, that's the reclamation of the blood of the saints from Babylon the Great. And then the tree of life is the parent function is shared with the world as the tree of life, the world's tree, the tree of life in some sense. And you can, and this is slightly problematic because in some sense you share the fruit of the tree of life with everyone, but that doesn't mean that they can receive it. Just because you share it doesn't mean that the world can receive it. But that is how you know that is how you can see people then clearly through the tree that is in the midst of the garden. Uh, in some sense, it's kind of like the reestablishment of the Holy Ghost, uh, because you understand all of these things, the wheels within the wheels and such, of the other people in some sense. So you have some ability to in some sense know the spirit of man well enough. In some sense, the world tree, the tree of life, is like the spirit of man tree. Um, that's too doctrinally complicated to get into that. But anyway, um, knowledge of the spirit of man essentially is what grows from the tree of life. And because basically I'm also making the argument that the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is the same as the tree of life. It was the same tree, but it was partaken in a different attitude. It was partaken in a different seduction, in the intrigue of the serpent and Eve. And in some sense, and I went through this in the other example. I'm not going to decode this kind of allegory, but anyway, that then the fruit of the tree of life is essentially a new heaven and a new earth. And then the dead that have been locked into Hades and in the sea and stuff like that. I think that would be after the new heaven and the new earth. There are two more. Wait, let me count. One, two. Yeah, so there are just two more functions after that, which are essentially probably uh, death and Hades, that are sort of locked in the sea of the world, which is essentially the subconscious, which then releases the dead, and that is essentially the what was uh, let me work this out. What was the parent function and the dominant function? The parent function and the dominant function in the subconscious then get released. And the weird thing is that the inferior and when that gets released, then the unconscious side of the mind really does become the first side of the mind, because then the partition is properly sealed. There's a proper seal between the subconscious and the unconscious, because the unconscious is then given the inferior function, and the sin of the subconscious is then untethered and loosed, and it is given over to the unconscious. And so that just becomes part of the unconscious. The weird overlap between the subconscious and the unconscious is partitioned. And essentially the narcissistic gateway filter is not needed, because there's just a wall there now. The wall of the garden has been reestablished. So it's sort of it's the redevelopment of Eden. And in some sense this is probably to do with the archetype of Eden. Anyway, I think I've gone through this well enough, but anyway, so that's my model of self-actualization and spiritual enlightenment, I guess, or true spiritual enlightenment, rather than what I would argue was counterfeits. This is a bit annoying because I'm actually making this recording after all the other recordings, and I'm going to be slotting it in because I skipped over an issue that I wanted to attend to, and I kind of forgot about it, so this might be slightly out of place. But essentially what I wanted to repair was, I wanted to get onto the subject of speaking about the developmental nature of setting up the right kind of development that facilitates Keegan stage 4 to Keegan stage 5. That essentially the kind of the tentative partitioning that you need to start developing, at least when you are trying to create the unconscious side of the mind being untethered to the toxicity in the subconscious, which is somewhat unavoidable. That essentially, it's useful to create a dichotomy in terms of the subconscious, that in some sense, in principle, that the subconscious is in principle capable of being correct, but you don't know how that's possible, but you have to believe that it's possible, essentially, and that, in some sense, that whole dichotomy is going to be very problematic. It is going to cause problems on the other side of coming out of the unconsciousness and into the ego, which is what I would call the borderline gateway filter, which is what most people have a problem with, because even people that are supposedly 4.5 or in Keegan stage 4, in some sense, I think they still have a lot of residue from not traversing that portal properly. And in some sense, that's because there is a kind of there's so much ongoing complexity around the unconscious side of the mind, because it needs to be dependent on, what I've called this concept of the golden circuit. And in some sense, it comes from sort of two things. I think you have to perfect the vanity in the circuit, so and which is, so that you have a node in the middle of the metagram circuitry, so that you're not containing it from either side. You're not containing it between the bookends of the subconscious and the ego, and then you're sort of trying to take the unconscious side of the mind for granted, but you are actually involving yourself in it, trying to, or aiming to transcend it, rather than trying to kind of jump over it or skip over it, and then in some sense being sort of having to kind of inculcate within that jerry-rigged system a kind of a confected narrative that somewhat homogenizes some great tendencies in a very sort of unconscious way, but you have to sort of place yourself in the thick of it, sort of perfecting the vanity. And in that way, because you've got the central node within the unconscious side of the mind, you can kind of try to work out a stabilization between the two gateways. And this is all a tentative structure. Like everything that I'm describing is just a way to work out tentatively how to cut yourself off from the subconscious, which in some sense requires you to kind of invalidate the parent function in the subconscious and to kind of create a steel wall between your subconscious and your unconscious and try to create a kind of a present time ego, a present time active sort of sense of responsibility and postulating things from the ground up and somewhat untethering yourself from your own belief structure. A kind of nomadism, if you will. Something to do with the idea that the subconscious is fundamentally toxic, but it can't be cleaned up, not at this point. It cannot be tended to. It can only be cleaned up by sort of making the ego into a static state and then using that static state to then heal or reform the superego, and then the superego will have a reordering of the subconscious somewhat mechanically, and then you have a kind of untethered subconscious. But anyway, so I was just trying to say that. See, the problem is that you do need to have a dichotomy in the subconscious. In my diagram that I use with sort of Platonic metaphysics is kind of like the simultaneous mystery of life, that you have to kind of via negativa and via positiva, and then understand that there's something between the two, but that something between the two is only, let's say, properly grounded and properly sourced from the third segment of the divided line, which is the beginning of the realm of the intelligible, in the repartitioning in the end of things, or at least when you're going from Keegan stage 4 to Keegan stage 5. But so you do need to kind of confine yourself to a dichotomy. In some sense, the via negativa in the belief structure is less toxic. The via positiva in the subconscious, in your beliefs, that is what you really have to. I do think that you should actually not develop beliefs around what is positive. You should only have beliefs around what is essentially because already then you've got a bank of information which is ready to be activated by principle, which is ready to be kind of imparted into your principled thinking. So in some sense, then you will have values which then your parent function won't be able to kind of keep the keys to the kingdom away. You need to give the car keys over to the unconscious side of the mind. You need to let the teenager grow up. Is the vague metaphor. You can't sort of give the teenager the car keys and then always be the backseat driver, and while they're trying to grow up and grow into adolescence or something like that, because they'll never learn responsibility. They have to believe that they have the trust of the subconscious, the trust of the beliefs, and in some sense that they have the ability to sort of surpass a set of beliefs and an environmental kind of inculcation of a fixed static context, which beliefs naively, narcissistically require in order to stabilize themselves, because the beliefs somehow think that you can have an objective truth value about beliefs instead of knowing that they must be contextualized by the unconsciousness, otherwise it doesn't even mean anything. So if you have enough via negativa sort of understanding about your own beliefs, then they are in a readily readable form. They can be assimilated by the unconscious side of the mind, all the more so that the unconscious side of the mind can perfect its dominant function well enough that it can actually be a bulwark against the puppet strings of the subconscious via the parent function of the subconscious, this is a strained problem in some sense, because in some sense the unconscious side of the mind is only allowed to exist at all because of the parent function of the subconscious wanting to throw away the inferior function because of what it says about this, because the inferior function leads to the sin of the subconscious, which is very painful for the subconscious. So the subconscious already has fallen. The subconscious already, after it has one sin, the subconscious knows that the jig is up. And in some sense, the continuation of that theme just proves to itself that there's something rotten. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark. Beliefs don't work. You cannot have gold beliefs. It doesn't work. you have to have fluid beliefs, but it's not capable. You don't have the resources to have fluid beliefs. So you have to give it all. In some sense, you have to give up all your beliefs and allow them to be transcribed into your metagram circuitry. And in some sense, that is easier to do if your culture is more sane and less pathological and has good role models in it and has good messages in it. But you still need a bit of a variety, because without your own evaluation of these things, and because you have to learn it in your own circuitry, so you see other people's circuitry and you see different circuitry to you, and it impinges against you, and it's been around for longer than you, and you need to kind of be a bit of a scientist. So the Kegan stage 3 is kind of like is the scientific experimentation in some sense, or at least in some sense that maybe you hope to eventually graduate from it, is you have to realize that science is not enough. Science doesn't work. That you're not going to reach the end of the road. In some sense, you have to exhaust the idea that the solution is in the set of that the side of the mind that the unconscious represents is a kind of endless scientific inquiry that is like just a never-ending Ponzi scheme. It's always doubling down and going and just circling back around, recycling back in its recurring drama in some sense. And then the recurring of the drama is so painful that you try to invent a kind of a way in which you can steal some of the thunder of the ego while still kind of, so perfecting the vanity in the unconscious side of the mind is a double-edged sword, because it gives you both the power to close yourself off to the ego, or to regiment your relationship with the ego in the same way that it might give you the same power to regiment yourself against the subconscious. And you have to choose the right orientation, because one of the orientation requires hope and faith and a kind of a promise of things that is not yet fully understood in some sense. And the other one, when your Kegan stage 3 makes an ally out of Kegan stage 2, you can have a very, in some sense, that's a kind of and usually this is a phase which people grow through. This is almost like what 10-year-olds are like. 9, 10-year-olds, a little bit bratty, a little bit cocky, but it's a phase that has to be gotten through, because you have to, in some sense, you have to learn how to stabilize. In some sense, that could be also when you're trying to impregnate from the parent function in the subconscious, you're trying to transfer all the goodness of the subconscious, then the via negativa, you need to charge into your dominant function in your unconscious. And that means that you do have to experiment how the via negativa in the subconscious becomes a positive principle. You need to construct principles in the unconscious circuitry. So your unconscious circuitry is almost made out of heuristics. It's made out of these sorts of these how these things interrelate inside your own sense of thinking. And in some sense, again, this is more complicated because I'm not getting into the extraneous thing. That this has to do with the concept of the prime death, which is the death of the subconscious in some sense. That this project is in some sense very archetypally linked to Seth in the Bible, in Genesis, in the Genesis story, that Seth was born to replace the death of Abel, who Seth is said to be born in the image of Adam, that Seth is born in the image of Adam to replace Abel. Because the dominant function Cain killed Abel. So if you say that the death of the subconscious is like Adam, the child function of the subconscious, or the lust of the subconscious, is Eve. The firstborn of theirs is Cain, so the vanity, the dominant function, is Cain. Then Abel is the parent function, and then Cain kills Abel in some sense, out of wrath. And then Seth is born to replace him, and Seth is the inferior function, which leads on from the parent function. And then Seth is the death of the unconscious, is the starting point, is the repurposed inferior function, is the beginning of the chain in the unconscious. And that has to essentially that gets passed, or that inferior function gets passed on into essentially a new vanity, a new dominant function. It goes from the death to the lust, or the child function, to the dominant function. And so and that is the only, because you must remember that the death and the lust in the unconscious is the trial, or the inferior function, and the sin of the subconscious. So the sin is being repurposed as the child function in the unconscious, and the death is being repurposed as the trial in the subconscious is being repurposed as the death in the unconscious, and then the synthesis of the death and the child function creates a new dominant function. And so when that new dominant function in the unconscious is properly established, then you've got a proper synthesis of the inferior and the sin of the last side of the mind in a new city, in a new vanity, in a new great city of Babel, Babylon. In a new Babylon the Great. Although actually, the Tower of Babel is probably a better metaphor for the unconscious side of the mind, because the unconscious side of the mind is literally not just a new city, it's a project that's already begun. In some sense, you just came across a whole lot of people building a great city of Babel. Like you're Seth, and now you've walked away from your family because you don't know how to relate to anyone, because your older brother is a murderer, and you are the replacement of the death of your sibling, which you never knew because you replaced him, and you were supposedly born in the image of your father, Adam. So you don't know how to deal with anyone in your family, because your mother is the mother of a murderer and a dead sibling, and you are now the replacement of the dead sibling. You don't know how to deal with any of these people, and you are somehow a new Adam yourself. You're born in the image of Adam. So you have to go make your own way, and then you go make your own way, and then already there's a project, already there's a civilization that's trying to build a Tower of Babel, and they all maybe speak different languages, and you think, maybe I can fit in here, maybe can I be the missing piece of this puzzle, that we can all talk the same language, or we all seem to be doing the same project. But then as you get taller and taller in the project, you realize we're not going to make it. This tower is not going to reach heaven. The unconscious side of the mind is not going to reach heaven. It's not going to reach the pinnacle of the ego. It's not going to reach even the inferior of the ego function. It's not going to read. It's not going to reach the inferior function in the ego side of the mind. It falls apart before then, because there's a necessary sacrifice that's needed, and the Tower of Babel thinks that they can avoid learning the technology of the crucifixion. Their form of unconscious codependency and integrity collectivization. In some sense, the Tower of Babel is almost the symbol of a hive, of an insect hive. That's the idea that a human being can plug themselves into an insectoid relation with their collective, or something like that, and then they end up losing meaning itself, in some sense, that they can't communicate meaning to one another, because of the nature of the project has somewhat dehumanized their souls. Or in some sense, the idea is that the unconscious side of the mind is enough, and it's not enough. You can't just fit in with the program. You can't just try to fit into the narrative and try to make the narrative prettier and make a taller building and make a thing that looks nicer, or something like that. I mean, obviously we can appreciate aesthetics, but we must be founded in the first things, and the principles are more important. And so that's the problem with the Tower of Babel, in some sense, is that they're not trying to build a tower of objective morality. They're trying, who knows what they're trying to do. They're not trying to find real morality. Or when I say objective morality, I mean within that special context that objective morality is a goal, is a transcendent goal that that you have to kind of believe in a common spiritual father, essentially, that animates all life or all agency or at least all sentience, that there is some kind of order or natural law or something like that. Um, you have to have faith in something like that, and you have to realize the importance of sharing faith in something like that. All the mystery schools would not take anyone into them if they said that they were an atheist. They had to believe in monotheism, otherwise, essentially, they wouldn't even touch you. Which, in some sense, that might be cashed out in different ways, but essentially, you have to have faith to attain to the single faith, or something like that. That there is attainable a single faith, because otherwise you're not sort of committed. Otherwise, you are already still committed to the Tower of Babel. You're still stuck in your unconscious side of the mind, and it's weird because in some sense this is the question. This is actually where the question of predestination exists. Is that when you see someone in a certain unconscious state, and you have to wonder, I mean, in some sense, it depends who's looking at you at the time, in some sense, to say, well, I'll try and plant the seed of the kingdom of God in you, and maybe you'll even plant the seed, but then it'll be washed away. Maybe you'll even show something of it, and then nothing will come of it, because that's that parable of the seed and the and the rocky soil and the shallow soil and the soil that is too waterlogged, and all those sorts of things. So it's a very important parable here. It's all sort of related to this kind of stuff. But anyway, yeah. So the question is that will the generation of Seth precipitate someone who can sort of actually make it out of the flood or something like that? Because in some sense, the unconscious side of the mind, I've already described, or I will describe, depending on where I cut this in, that the third side of the mind is alchemically symbolized by water. And the wickedness of people who think that they can build a tower to the heavens out of water, or I mean out of principle alone, you need a static air. You can't just have the atmosphere always blowing about, the winds of doctrine. You need to have, in some sense, this is a bit of a mixed up metaphor, but anyway, the Son of Man is actually always is described quite beautifully in the scriptures as coming on a cloud. The clouds are the mystery in the atmosphere that you have to see and look inside of. And in some sense, the reason why the Son of Man is coming on a cloud is because it's cloudy, it's mysterious, and it's already hidden in your principles. So the Son of Man is somewhere in the Tower of Babel, but he's not at the top of the tower, and it's never going to make it, but he's somewhere in the tower. He's in one of the levels of the tower. You can find a cloud, maybe. You can halfway go up the Tower of Babel until you can be around the clouds, something like that, or you can get a different vantage of the cloud. But he's hiding somewhere in those structures. But in some sense, that structure is part of something that's unholy. But anyway, I mean, in some sense, the mysteries are in that way. The mysteries, the clouds, they're all polygamous in their connotation. So how do you want to cut the mystery? How do you want to, what can you see in a cloud? And the Son of Man is coming on a cloud, and it could be any cloud for you. I mean, there'll be a particular cloud for you, maybe, and in some sense, it's because it's not actually in the cloud; it's already in you, but you have to, this is one of the mysteries in some sense that you're giving yourself the excuse to look inside. You're to find the idea that the wheels within wheels within wheels, that all the principles do have a hierarchy, an order, that they do come into a single chorus and symphony and such, that there is a one, there is the good, and it is static. And the people that want to say that no, it's not static, it's tentative and contextual or whatever, they are using the wrong side of the mind to do the wrong thing. They are instead trying to have static beliefs or hinge, or I mean, maybe they won't. They'll have half their beliefs are fluid and half of them will be static linchpins. And I'm sorry, that doesn't work. You have to be static in your own ego in some sense. And the only way to become static is to be constantly crucifying your fleshly thinking, which is the parent function in the ego, which is very analogous to the four sides of the mind that C.S. Joseph talks about. But I do disagree with the construction of MBTI types. But anyway, I dealt with that at the beginning of this recording. But anyway, I mean, so I'm jumping all over the place, but I just wanted to say that essentially you should believe that there is a dichotomy, a simple dichotomy in the subconscious. But I just want to say that that is also a tentative model, because in some sense there is via negativa and via positiva, and I would argue to just stay on the via negativa in building your subconscious, because then you won't have such an offensive narcissism then. Your naive narcissism growing up won't be so offensive. And in some sense, this also you can twist children quite badly, because if parents have quite a disgusting sense of borderline gateway filter, if their borderline gateway filter is very misshapen, then they will project a lot of narcissism onto their child, and then the child that has via negativa subconscious beliefs will quite rightly resist the untoward corruption of their parents in some sense. And this is why and in some sense, even if the parents are well-meaning, and it doesn't matter, the parents themselves, if they don't have this kind of metaphysical nuance or sophistication or something like that, or even if they do have some of that, you can't perhaps perform at the level at which I'm describing it, because you can't teach children too early. Perhaps, I mean, you can model it to them maybe, and you can try. If you give a lot of one-on-one attention, maybe you can teach them if you are kind of gifted, because in some sense this is very sophisticated, but it is incrementally perhaps able to be taught to children, very young children, I mean. But also I do think that there's a natural yeah, I mean, it's better not to be too sort of, you don't want to undermine people's self-directedness in some sense. That there are ways to kind of participate with your child and be pedagogical that way, rather than being instructive and playing the role of a moral authority, because that makes no sense to a subconscious in a child. It really doesn't make any sense. But usually there is a natural inclination towards admiration and following the lead in some sense. But once I would say that a child already has a useful amount of via negativa, and then they are being undercut by their parents' sort of borderline tendency, there is a natural, or I would even say a moral form of reticence that the child will have in questioning authority. And in some sense, this itself might even be a positive thing in the full scope of things, because that will make themselves perhaps quite much more sensitive to the problem of the of the borderline gateway, the 3.5 between the unconscious and the ego. So in some sense, the extra trouble that you go through as a subconscious might lend itself to extra resources and extra sort of guidance, as a model for oneself in one's own memory bank or whatever, when traversing the very tricky and sophisticated issue of progressing from Kegan stage 3 to Kegan stage 4. in some sense, the themes of false authority could have already been explored in some sense. But that might also have a non-linear correlation to different types, because I do think that my metatype and my metagram circuitry, even perhaps, are very robust metatypes, and that I think might also be because I contrived my own false ego complex, that I designed it. I fell into the false ego complex in a very controlled way, in which I almost designed it to fulfill the project of understanding the false ego complex. And so, I mean, well, either I'm just a crackpot and a lunatic, and I've sort of just invented everything, and I've just completely contrived it all. But according to my own modeling, I have one of the very few types that has a metagram circuitry that extends over all the four fields of or I guess you would call it the field circuits of. So in some sense, there in the unconscious, you can potentially be connected to two or more field circuits. Some types are only connected to two or three, and very few types are connected to all four. And so the ones that are connected to a four, in some sense, they have their finger in every pie or something like that. So they kind of, anyway, it's an interesting angle. It might not be that important in the round, but in some sense, it does also mean that you have more of a capacity. You perhaps have less of a blind spot, or you have more sensitivity. So I mean, it is a lot harder, I think, probably to. I mean, well, in some sense, I don't think it's possible to have a presence in all field circuits, probably without having a split circuit like I have, and essentially that makes me prone to having, or potentially having, borderline type 1. So I mean, that's the sort of the cost of that, is that it takes me twice as long to sort of, but also in some sense it can also be easier, because then in some sense, if one of my circuits is more developed than my other circuit, or one of my circuits is healthier than my other circuit, then in some sense I already have an internal communion, which is possible. So in some sense I already have the prerequisite of, uh, of an internal dialogue, and in some sense it's easier to have that internal dialogue because it's right immediately there, accessible to my consciousness. My ego has a hand over two circuits. Anyway, this is all extraneous information, but also the other non-linearity between the types is that different people will have differently constituted egos, which means that in some sense the activity of growing up into stage 4 will be somewhat unique based on that particular constitution. Well, I mean, not so unique, but essentially there'll be 17 varieties of what in Scientology is called the tone arm, um, which is essentially the condition, or the particular, or in this sense, is not the condition, but it's the actual anatomy of cognitive functions that make up your free theta, that make up your present time ability to think freely in the present, that survey the architecture of all your other circuitry of your subconscious and your unconscious. And that does probably have some ability to also intuit, or at least be connected to the superego, but there's very little in the superego to be connected to, because essentially it's just a floating parent function, and in some sense it is that floating parent function has a nebulous dominant function and a nebulous child function and a nebulous death behind it. So it's sort of like, I can't think of a good metaphor, but maybe it's sort of like a weird kind of mysterious fable. It's like a smoke monster that also leaves gifts behind, but it's like, you don't know if they're poisoned or what they are, but it's much wider than that, though, because it's sort of like it's the secret god of the world, it's the god of lies, it's the false prophet, and it's sort of, blended into the background that you can't even see it anymore. Um, and to sort of and the only way to properly put the false prophet in the lake of fire is by going up through the ego into the superego, is extending the hand of the ego, has enough control over its own domain that then it can reach up into the superego and establish the New Jerusalem as the dominant function in the superego, and be careful not to develop the child function in the superego. And to somewhat correspond the inferior function with the dominant function. The inferior function of the ego needs to sort of be commensurate and needs to somewhat equivalently implant its insight of disagreement and its experience. So sort of the experience of the crucifixion from the inferior function's point of view needs to be implanted into the growth of the New Jerusalem, which is the dominant function, the superego. That those two things need to be in a resonance. That's a kind of teleportation that's happening there. That the charge in the crucified, the experience of the crucifixion, which is the torture that was given to the inferior function, that in some sense sacrificed the fleshly thinking, but the actual experience of that sacrifice and the experience of being dead to the sin of the world, then that all of that experience from the inferior function's perspective is attuned to the cognitive function that corresponds to the superego's dominant function. And that essentially creates a golden root that reestablishes the tree of life, where the false prophet was sort of doling out the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which was the subsequent, then the two preceding cognitive functions after the false prophets, which was the death and the lust of the subconscious. So then now the subconscious no longer has a death and a lust, it instead has a new heaven and a new earth. And then that new heaven and the new earth frees gives freedom to the dominant function and the parent function, that sets free the subconscious's dominant function and parent function to be partitioned against the inferior function and the sin of the subconscious. So the subconscious loses its sin, and then all the toxicity and also its inferior function, as those are just given over wholesale to the unconscious side of the mind. So the unconscious side of the mind reconvenes itself and reseals itself, and there's a boundary wall, there's a garden wall there that then is created between the subconscious and the unconscious, and the unconscious really does then become the first place. And the parent function and the dominant function in the subconscious give up their dead, but because they operate freely and they don't precipitate an inferior function. So you're unburdening or liberating the parent function and the dominant function of the subconscious. And so in some sense, maybe that also, I mean, you see, whenever you say dominant function, it's displacing the vanity, but yeah, I still don't know archetypally what to call that, because in some sense that's just that's maybe that's the kingdom in the earth. Then there are also two things there, so I don't know how to label them. But I do think that those things will give up their dead, the skeletons of those things, because in some sense those were the conduits of toxicity that plagued all the other sides of the mind. But in some sense, what's more important than working out how those are free and how to visualize that, in some sense, they're free. So it's not that important to visualize what they're doing or how they're doing it, but it's very important to get the stabilization that all comes rooted from the New Jerusalem, which is the dominant function of the superego. That is the thing that you have to make sure is somewhat married to the inferior function in the ego. That is the bride, essentially. Or, I don't know, maybe the city is the bride and the inferior function is the Christ. The inferior function in the ego is like the crucifixion and is constantly crucifying itself. I die daily. And that is married to the New Jerusalem in the superego. But it's interesting because I do think there are a lot of parallels here as well, because the process of this, is probably spoken of in Revelations when it talks about the woman and the dragon that flies away with the child to be born and such and such. That flies away with the dragon, that woman that flies away with the dragon with the child is, I think, exactly what I was talking about when I say that you have to wait in your grave for 3 days before you resurrect. That the first day is the day of the crucifixion where you die to the sin of the world. That's the first day. The second day is the child function, which is also very much, I linked it archetypally with the Whore of Babylon, and the dragon might be essentially the archetype of Babylon the Great, and they all fly away and go away. And then the child, and you never really hear about what happens of that child, but essentially the thing that is born, that is precipitated, is the New Jerusalem, which is somewhat in the displacement of Babylon the Great. And I've talked about I will, depending on where this is cut, talk about the reclamation of the blood in the stone and the mortar of Babylon the Great. Anyway, So anyway, I do think it's all worked out. I should try to get models where I can display these a bit more nicely so that it's more accessible to people, I guess, to start experimenting. Or that sounds so irresponsible. I really should get a book written about this, or some kind of, just something that's accessible, I guess, but at least it's in print. But yeah, I mean, it does probably require quite a lot of knowledge related to MBTI just to be familiar with it. This is kind of a political aside, I guess, talking about the morality around politics. I mean, the ancient Republicans understood quite well that if you are entitled to to some kind of, if you're a beneficiary that is enjoying some kind of entitlement, that in some sense the entitlement produced by some kind of government policy or program, then to the extent to which that you require what is entitled to you, or you are dependent on what is entitled to you, or even if you, I mean, in some sense this can be like a kind of a process of being slowly boiled, that essentially, because of this hidden morality, this hidden topic of integrity, that in some sense, if you start becoming the beneficiary of too many entitlements, then you are indistinguishable from being a slave. It's indistinguishable if you're, so it cultivates this very kind of disgusting and in this sense, the ancient Republicans understood both sides of this argument. This is why they so hated wage slavery, which in some sense they imagined only existed not because of, essentially because it was hard to obtain capital. I mean, in some sense that is maybe one formulation of the issue, but in some sense the issue is one of access to producing an alternative or something like that, or to to a large extent, the bar to access is the government itself now, is licenses, is red tape, is having to conform to regulations, that you can't just fill a niche in a market. You can't just be able and have a productive capacity or generative capacity or a creative capacity. You have to conform to the bureaucracy, which is usually designed for large-scale business that has legal departments or HR departments, or that has to fulfill quotas or has to sort of jump through hoops, which only an organization of a certain size can even afford to absorb the cost thereof. And in some sense, that is this kind of neo-feudalism that I think that is the real source of this neo-feudalism. In some sense, the problem is not that wages are stagnating and wages are too low, although that might be a little bit part of it. But in some sense, I don't think that that's. I mean, in some sense, to the point that wage stagnation is a thing that is usually only for unskilled workers, and that to some extent is also a symptom of unchecked. I don't know what they call it, like migratory labor, in which, for certain sectors, you allow foreigners to have temporary work permits or whatever, and you're paying them at a lower wage because they don't live in the same area and they don't have the same cost of living or something like that, because they go back to an economy that has a different level of cost of life and such. And so you're actually you're removing labor opportunity, and you're in some sense incentivizing, because usually if it's too expensive to hire someone to do something, you have to find a way to make that job more productive, which requires some kind of mechanization or some kind of tool or some kind of innovation that allows you to increase the productivity of that role, and to make it more dynamic perhaps. And then you would maybe need also someone that might be a little bit more skilled, or you make better tools that mean that you don't have to get people that are more skilled, but someone that can just use the tool or something like that. So that would be how you would get around, oh well, we can't hire locally because then essentially the business model wouldn't even function, because we need this much labor and it's too expensive if we have to increase the cost in order to attract the amount of labor that the business requires. You'd have to find a way to innovate, essentially. Now, that is all lost when you just essentially open your borders and you just have unchecked immigration. You are going to depress unskilled work and labor in your own country, which is what has happened in America, essentially, excessively. And people, I think, have a political right to be sensitive to that economic sense of I mean, in some sense, that is going to war with your own lower class, uh, under the fake banner of humanitarianism to foreigners or something like that. Nations do have a right to their own citizens before the citizens of other countries. Otherwise, there's just no way that anything ever comes together cohesively, and sort of, if you're kind of playing this weird kind of, well, we're all human, so it doesn't matter what the people in our population are how they're surviving and how their unskilled wages have been depressed by the introduction of essentially a foreign labor market, diluting uh, what would otherwise be the natural market pressure of having to increase the price uh, for labor and paying more to unskilled workers. So anyway, that's one issue that used to be a left-wing issue, which is now weirdly the left in America, or the radical progressives. They don't care about their own working class anymore. Very strange. Um, and then they call their own working class racist or something like that for not allowing for their class interest to essentially just go out the window. But essentially, the alternative to wage slavery essentially was supposed to be the ability for an individual to be productive in their own, that essentially you could just buy a plot of land and you could grow something, or you could become a producer of something, or you could gain a skill or something like that. To the extent to which that is all the markets, vertical integration. Vertical integration is essentially the modern scourge of what the ancient Republicans would have complained about in terms of wage slavery. That perhaps there needs to be some kind of antitrust development around vertical integration. Um, because that is a different kind of monopolization of different sectors, of different markets, that make it impossible for people to actually, because what's the point of being a farmer if you can't sell your produce at the supermarket, because the supermarket is virtually integrated and owns its own farms, and they will only sell produce that is sourced from their own farms, never mind the quality or something like that. So, but in some sense, this can also, perhaps there need to be new models of, I mean, because that can also just be solved by competition, but in some sense, the health of the market, or the health of the opportunity landscape within a society, you do need to have some good actors that are almost like good Samaritans, trying to work out how to keep the, let's say, the American dream alive in some sense, in at least when the legislative arm of government itself is not on the ball in terms of being responsible for holding these things at bay, like the ancient Republicans worried about, where they worried about people being beholden to entitlements from the government, because then effectively losing their integrity and effectively becoming a kind of pseudo slave class, a kind of an underclass. And at the same time, they were also very much opposed to essentially practices of things that roughly equate to wage slavery. And to a large extent, education is meant to be also the tool with which you can kind of, if you're not interested in educating yourself, then maybe it's, you have that hope for the next generation, that you have a high standard of education, which essentially that has been degraded in America in terms of the quality of schooling. And this also has to do with, essentially, I would say, the corruption of psychology and the corruption of certain ways of understanding how education works. Because you can also kind of make quite a good sympathetic case as to I do think that some things are developmentally inappropriate, that you can't give people that are too young. I mean, you can try to develop tools of critical thinking and things like that, but at some point, you do need to let things organically sort of. I mean, I do think that was the point somewhat of the American system, is that it gave people the breathing room to kind of, that there was a different level of education at college than at high school, because high school is meant to be easy enough that you can develop your own understanding about the subjects. And then when you go to college, you get retaught from the ground up in some sense on that new level, in contradistinction to how you meandered through it by yourself, developing your own kind of way of navigating it. And that, I think, has a lot of utility to it, because it does give a kind of de facto independence. Although now, I mean, already what I just said might be anachronistic, because now I think the new thing is that you get spoon-fed the whole way, or you get led by the nose the whole way, and there's this very little sense of having an independent idea of assimilating the knowledge yourself and growing your own understanding, which was, in some sense, I think, part of the Western diet in terms of the culture of a kind of, classically liberal sense of owning yourself, self-determinism, integrity, and all those sorts of things. But sadly, all of these things are held so loosely within the American system. I mean, I won't repeat all my critiques against the American legal tradition, which, to my mind, is very much corrupt. In some sense, it's not its fault that it's so corrupt. It's just the fact of the matter is that they developed their legal system prematurely in history, perhaps, but also that experience needed to happen so that people could understand these things. But I mean, perhaps in the Federalist Papers and things like that, they weren't aware of all the other options that existed throughout history. They didn't do quite as much homework as they could have to create a more robust, substantive legal framework that the federal states could be properly catered to, and in some sense, the independence of each state is also made the legalism in the federated, kind of context fundamentally nebulous and weird. But anyway, the main point that I wanted to center this on is, to the extent to which you are entitled, you are a slave to the thing that provides the entitlement. And in some sense, because government doesn't produce anything itself, it's taxes, you become beholden to, let's say, it's weird, but I mean, I've often given these examples. I mean, I've explained this not recently in my recordings, but as a thought experiment, it's useful to go through. The concept of a flat tax is a very interesting concept, because you see, in some sense, if you committed yourself to having a flat tax, a flat rate of tax across the board for every bracket, then government would have the right incentive for growth. Because in some sense, you understand, if you have a progressive tax regime, and I just mean to explore this on the level of a thought experiment, if you have a progressive tax regime, it is more lucrative for government to help the rich get richer, because then they have a greater rate of tax that they collect. If the GDP grows, but it's distributed disproportionately to the lower portion of society, although the GDP will increase, the tax collection won't increase at the same rate, because if disproportionately more people of a lower standing got that growth. So ironically, government's interests are always aligned with the super rich, just on a fiscal level of revenue collection. This is a very disgusting, perverse incentive when people start to realize how these things actually exist de facto. That in some sense, I mean, this is how Tony Blair's New Labour was all functioning. It was all funded by the finance. Tony Blair made this deal, essentially, which was that we are going to help our financial industry soar into the upper echelons of making as much money as they can. We're going to give them all the regulation that they want. We're going to be as friendly as we can to our financial services, but they're going to pay their taxes, and we're going to use those taxes to fund new labor programs. In some sense, it was the most responsible kind of democratic socialism that had ever existed, because instead of blaming the rich for being rich, they were actually doing it consciously, helping the rich to make their money so that they could fund their social programs. And the problem is that democratic socialism has this slavery inculcated into it, that it's very easy to get people into the vogue of, oh yes, I should be entitled to this. And then they don't see their own deprivation, their own self-degradation of their integrity. So, they end up having to live in a world where this narrative justifies it, where it's a justified extraction or something like that, which is essentially, I think, indistinguishable from the slave morality, what Nietzsche would have called a slave morality, at least. And so, and that really does have very toxic effects, because once people start developing rhetoric and propaganda around slave morality, then you start getting a very toxic doom spiral, essentially. And even if you might think that you can rehabilitate people on the individual level, de facto, societally, they know that their culture is dependent on a slave morality narrative, and they won't give it up, because then they would have to kind of invalidate their group or invalidate their toxic subculture. And so you do end up with toxic subcultures, and in some sense, this is all a knock-on effect of essentially, this big brother government, this nanny government. And then you have this perennial trade-off between sustainability and sympathy. The more you lean into sympathy, the more you have an unsustainable cultural deficit in some sense, that you need to plug the hole of, that you need to find a scapegoat, that you need to kind of invent some kind of pseudo-intellectualism that continues to perpetuate, the justification of these things and how we're going to double down and get through it and pull through it and have it all be redeemed in the end. In some sense, it's like a collective narcissism. It's a collective kind of intellectual. It's something like, I do think it's kind of in the image of a kind of systemic borderline personality disordered mentality. It's like a mob mentality, and it ends up losing itself in the crowd. It can't see the wood from the trees, and it has to live in narrative. It lives in mythology and the proto-fascism kind of that I've somewhat insinuated and described before becomes palpable. And so you get this very unbridled rage, this very juvenile kind of rage. Oh, it's just unfair. Oh, it's just. Nothing is just, it's contextual. Save me your narcissistic beliefs, please. Let's work from principles. Let's work from the first things. Principally, how do we solve these things from the level of cause, not from the level of effect? I'm repeating words from Mark Passio. And people can't listen to, I've said it before in this very recording, they don't like to listen to him because in some sense he's a bit too authentic, that he's not plugged into some kind of slave morality. I must say I would probably disagree with some of his opinions, but I'm sure that we could hash that out. Because he's not wedded to his opinions in some sense. I don't think he believes in facts being objective in some sense. Well, or in some sense, the significance of facts and the contextual significance of facts is what needs to kind of, the context matters. Well, both matter in some sense, but observations that can be made after contextualized by some kind of in some sense, the only thing that can bring this kind of contextualization is what I've already spoken of before, a kind of objective morality. Mark Passio talks about natural law. I guess I do see that subject as being slightly more sophisticated, because I do think that I haven't watched everything that Mark Passio has said recently or anything like that, but I'll just say that I do think that natural law, maybe I would see it as broader and also including of the divine. Well, I know that Mark Passio also would include that stuff into natural law, but that it does actually make us beholden to needing to essentially attain towards one faith, at least in principle. Maybe not in practice with everyone, because you just realize, well, we are just at an impasse, so we'll have to, maybe in a different time, in a different place. But apart from particular impasses in principle, that we should all, get together and work it out, as it were. That we should be amenable to such a type of process, so that we can come into coordination and collaboration or something like that. The idea that through cooperation you can actually maximize and sort of not languish in the suboptimal or something like that. But in some sense, that doesn't sound naturally like law, but that's a kind of, in some sense, and the complicated bit is that in some sense you have to know how to have a certain level of etiquette or decorum in terms of the people that you do disagree with. You need to work out, let's say, a secular space of tolerance within some kind of framework. So, a place and a time for everything in some sense. And how you cash that out from national law, from natural law into national law, or even any form of other law other than natural, I do think that there is actually that is a necessary adaptive sort of way that you obviously need to be rooted in your own internal natural law and have an internal locus of control based on that, but you would hope to live in a community that would correspond with your values, that would tolerate, if it didn't correspond directly with all of your values, that it would at least tolerate all of them, or that there would be a space of in terms of respecting your integrity enough to engage with them, and where it actually outlaws certain expressions or certain values or something like that, that it has that it's committed to defending that line, not with violence but with reason and with argument, and within something above board, essentially, something that isn't just like a fiat of, well, a majority said that it should be against the law. That's not good enough. It has to be more integrated than that. But it also has to be eminently sort of manifest. You have to be able to manifest some perhaps kind of evidence on behalf of it, or some form of substantiation which appears to be justified. And you should at least be very embarrassed if you can't supply that. And that should perhaps even be grounds to remove that kind of stricture. Anyway, I'm kind of babbling a bit, but and I guess what I'm talking about is judging people based on the quality of their causativeness and not on the quality of their effect. And what I'm somewhat doing there is I'm even breaking up cause and effect. That qualities of causativeness in some sense, and that is something, the closest that I can come to describing principles, is sort of having a system of causative knowledge, of causativeness, of rationales and meta-rationales. I mean, to the extent to which I keep on repeating myself, I apologize, but I wonder. Anyway, the sense of entitlement thing is almost a good metaphor for the borderline gateway filter between the unconscious and the ego, uh, which the most stable thing to talk about in terms of that is the dominant function in the ego, not from the unconscious side, because the unconscious side, it's split between, I mean, I haven't even worked out how to exactly model that, because it is fundamentally, it also depends on the subtype of the metagram circuit. So it's going to be like, in some sense, there. When I say that there are two things, there are even three things, because the no, the parent function in metagram circuitry, I'm not exactly sure how to resolve that confusion and integrate it into metatype yet, but the parent function in the metagram circuitry is doubly complicated because the inferior function of the metagram circuitry and the sin of the metagram circuitry is perhaps also adjacent to the metatype substrate that it sits on top of, but that those metagram tones themselves, those emotional cross-wiring of other elements of the metatype that makes that piece of that circuit that plugs and stores charge on those things, that it then has its command center in the unconscious side of the mind, the inferior function and the sin of the metagram circuitry is repetited, is a repetitive instance of other metagram circuitry earlier in the chain. Now, I don't have my notes in front of me, but essentially this comes in 3 sets of patterns. There are 3 types of subtypes of metagram circuit that generally correspond with sattva, rajas, and tamas. And for example, and I don't want to talk out of turn because I'm not looking with my notes in front of me, and I might also be slightly off on this modeling because I don't exactly know how to combine metatype and metagram yet. I need to play with it in terms of how the model is displayed, and then work with it a little bit and think about it and work out which one is more, which because I mean I will try to make it as simple as possible and then work out which of the simplest distillations is probably the operative kind of thing, and at least discard the other ones or by process of elimination or something. But because I'm not sure if it's merely, if I probably am inclined to think that it's both, that there is a metatype unconsciousness and then there's a metagram unconsciousness, and the one is the substrate of the other, but because the substrate is also prone to being cross-wired by the thing that is occluding it, which is the metagram circuitry and the tones, the metagram emotions that are tied together in the circuitry, and then because that circuitry itself is even wrapped around itself, because the last 2 items are repeats of earlier items. So when it gets to those last 2 items, it's very painful for the metagram circuit because it's essentially resequencing itself out of time, out of place of its own flow. So it has problems within its own flow of circuitry. And so it actually tries to maladapt itself. It actually, within itself, it has a reticence to make a full cycle. And when it eventually does make a full cycle, which is usually when it's quite young, usually in your early teens, you actually do see the end of your metatype. You do at least one full circuit. And then you even gain some access into your ego, because only when you make the full circuit, essentially only the last 2 sequences, the last 2 tones in the metagram circuit are the door into the ego, which is why the ego's death and child function are part of metagram architecture in a way in which that they are both. They are both in the ego and in the metagram, which is why I leave them out of when I say that the ego has 4 free cognitive functions. I don't include the child function and I don't include the death of the ego. I only start talking from the dominant function. The dominant function is fully free, and all the subsequent ego functions are fully free. So those cognitive functions are actually sitting with you in real time, in present time. But your dominant function usually has got, through the development of your teenage years, usually something like that, you've developed a way to plug back into your unconscious because the ego itself is painful because of the inferior function. And in some sense, I can't talk across the board because it is, let's say, culturally specific. Some people might even have an operative parent function in their ego, but they usually never have an operative inferior function. So I don't know. Some people that are 4.5 might be more toxic than other people that are 4.5 because some might have more control over their parent function and some might have less control and are more about creating a barrier. But even the ones that just use their parent function will also have they will have jagged barbed wire all over their dominant ego function. Their their dominant function in their ego will be militarized, essentially. It will have this kind of passcode to be let in to talk to its parent function. Its parent function will be essentially a bit of a coward because it's afraid of its own inferior function, essentially, because it never learned how to get along with its own inferior function. It has a very sort of hot and cold relationship with this inferior function, and so it kind of sends itself into an abyss, into a doom spiral, if it experiences its inferior function too much, because it can't actually handle its own fucking ego. It hasn't worked out how to crucify itself. But it can manage it. It has some kind of management system, which in some sense is more about 3.5 and 2.5, which is another form of 4.5ness. So it's a kind of Kegan stage 4.5ness that is kind of thinking, because it has open access to all the other sides of the mind, but it's doing it by reaching down, not by reaching up into the superego. It's doing it by reaching down, and it's messing with the unconscious in some sense, or it is a mess of the unconscious, reaching up into the ego, but it's also reaching down into the subconscious and manhandling the subconscious and inventing interesting heuristic beliefs, which are fundamentally fictitious. They're fables. They're part of a kind of mythological generalization and sociological reductionism, or some kind of narrative. So they're living in a narrative that is concocted by their own subconscious. Instead of cleansing their subconscious and freeing their subconscious in a fluid way, they've got a kind of a heuristic that is meant to mimic fluidity. So they're reaching down, they're not reaching up. They're not going through, they're reaching back, in some sense, from all the way from their parent function. So in some sense, these people are parent function focused egos. They're not inferior function focused. Because if you were inferior function focused, you would realize that you have to sacrifice the parent function in your ego. You have to have a more lighter touch on your parent function. And you have to sort out these problems from the dominant function in your superego. Which in some sense actually requires the sanctity and perhaps the intimacy of being able to kind of be vulnerable in terms of, that gives you the self-confidence to put it all out there on the table, as it were. To be fluid with the context enough that you don't lose yourself on the substance, and to be able to explore sort of radical things that might otherwise seem to sort of be invidious, and incisively, sort of derailing in terms of large tracts of your belief structures and such. In some sense, you don't have any sort of orthodox narrative, because once the narrative starts getting popped or prickled or whatever, the bubble of the narrative, because in some sense that's all you have, that is the proof in your 4.5ness that you're a Kegan stage 5, is that you're able to sustain a bubble in your subconscious. Whereas the true Kegan stage 5 doesn't have to have a bubble, because they can just make one at will. They can just they can recapitulate one. They can just create one on the fly. Sometimes they don't have to have one. They can let it emerge organically in some sense, because they are already purpose driven. They already have a teleological, principled outlook in some sense. So they don't depend on narrative, because they've got, let's say, a formula of knowing it in a more ethereal sense, in a more it's grounded in first things. It's not grounded in it's grounded in the third segment of the divided line. It's not grounded in the first or the second. So in some sense, like, all the treasure really is in the lesser of the greater, the third segment of the divided line. The fourth segment, symbolized by the ego, is static. And then the superego gets reformed and the subconscious gets let loose. Anyway, I guess I've... And in some sense, these 4.5s, what they're doing is they're entitling their subconscious to create these bubbles. And in some sense, they are proving the success of their bubbles is somewhat, or the potential, or the hypothetical success of these bubbles and the continuation of these bubbles. And this is, I do think that has a proto-fascistic kind of veneer to it. I mean, that's exactly, the Nazis would always dream about their 1,000-year Reich. That's these are people that think that the kingdom of God is a metaphor of a culture that is observable rather than a culture that is discernible. That is observable through the subconscious rather than discernible through the principle. These are people that don't want to develop their principles up to such a level and to be grounded in principle. They want to be grounded in the factoids or something, which is, I think, exactly sort of the cart before the horse sort of thing. But it's also it's more than that, because it's not just putting the cart before the horse. It's the whole procedure of how the sides of the mind actually synthesize into self-actualization is actually missing completely. Anyway.